Walter Crane counted out the coins one by one, setting each on the depot platform with the kind of deliberate care a man uses when he wants to make sure you understand exactly what he thinks you're worth. $7.50. He didn't look at her face while he did it. He looked at her luggage, one battered valise and a hat box that had seen better years, and his lip curled at the corner like a man who'd opened a parcel expecting silver and found tin. "That'll cover your passage back to Cincinnati," he said. "I'm a reasonable man. I'm not leaving you stranded." Evelyn Hart stood very still on that platform. The morning wind off the mountains cut right through her traveling coat, and the coal dust from the arriving train had already settled into the creases of her dress, and every single person in Redstone Creek who had come to witness the arrival of Walter Crane's mail-order bride was now watching her receive his charity instead. She did not pick up the coins. If you've ever been handed the price of your own dignity, if you've ever stood in a public place and been told quietly that you simply weren't worth the trouble, then you already know what Evelyn Hart felt in that moment. You know the particular silence that comes before a person decides who they are going to be. This is her story, and I promise you it doesn't end on that platform. Before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to you, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every comment, every thumbs up tells me you're out there, and that means everything to me. Now let's go back to that platform in Redstone Creek, Colorado, 1878, and find out what a woman does when a man tries to buy back the hope he already sold her. She had left Cincinnati on a Tuesday in late September with $42, a wool coat her mother had made in better years, and a letter from Walter Crane that she had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft. The letter was 3 pages. It described the shop he owned, dry goods, hardware, the only reliable supply point between Durango and the mountains, and it described the house, which had 4 rooms and a proper stove and a porch facing south. It described his position in the community. It described, in careful and slightly formal language, his desire for a capable and hard-working companion, a woman who understood that frontier life demanded partnership rather than luxury. It did not describe love. Evelyn had not expected love. At 31, she had stopped keeping that particular expectation anywhere she could easily reach it. What the letter promised was honest work, a stable roof, and a man who needed what she had to offer. After her father's death the previous spring, a quiet collapse at his desk, a heart that simply stopped. She had spent 4 months discovering the full architecture of his debts. The house in Cincinnati went to the bank. His shop inventory went to his creditors. His tools went to his former apprentice in exchange for 3 months of lodging, which had run out in August. Evelyn had no brothers. She had one cousin in Philadelphia who had written a sympathetic letter and enclosed $2, which she understood to mean that was the end of that. She had answered 6 mail-order advertisements. Only Walter Crane had written back. So she sold her mother's sewing machine, her grandmother's pearl earrings, and the small writing desk that had been the one piece of furniture she had always thought of as hers. She purchased her train ticket. She packed what remained into the valise and the hat box, and she bought herself a meal at the Cincinnati depot that was more substantial than she could afford, because she had decided that if she was going to walk into a new life, she was not going to do it on an empty stomach. The journey took 11 days with 2 transfers and a layover in Denver, where she had slept sitting up in the station waiting room rather than spend money on a hotel. She arrived in Redstone Creek on a Wednesday morning in October with $7 left to her name, a week-old bruise on her left knee from a luggage mishap in Denver, and what she privately considered an unreasonable amount of hope for a woman in her position. Walter Crane had been on the platform to meet her. She recognized him from the photograph he had sent, a broad, well-dressed man of about 50, with a neat mustache and the kind of careful posture that spoke of a person who was very aware of how he appeared to others. He had looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Later, much later, she would understand it as disappointment, the specific disappointment of a man who had constructed an idea in his mind and found the reality inconvenient. He had said hello. He had offered to carry her hat box. He had walked her to the edge of the platform, and then he had stopped and turned and said, very quietly, "Miss Hart, I find I must be direct with you." That was how it had started. Evelyn would replay the next 3 minutes, for months afterward, the way you replay a carriage accident, not because you want to relive it, but because your mind keeps trying to find the moment where a different choice would have changed the ending. Walter's circumstances, he explained, had changed. There had been some difficulty with a supplier. A significant debt, honestly incurred, now coming due at an unfortunate time. He was not in a position financially to take on a wife and the additional expenses that entailed. He was sorry for any inconvenience. He had thought it better to be honest now than dishonest later. He said all of this in the same measured, reasonable tone a man might use to explain why he was returning a piece of merchandise that hadn't suited him. I acted in good faith when I wrote the advertisement, he added. I want you to know that. Evelyn had stood very still through all of it. A skill she had developed young and perfected in the months after her father died, the ability to hold herself completely motionless while the ground shifted beneath her. If you didn't move, people sometimes couldn't tell how badly you were shaking inside. The circumstances that changed, she said when he had finished. When did they change? Walter blinked. He had not expected a question. He had expected tears or silence or acceptance. I beg your pardon? When did your circumstances change? Was it recently, or was it before you wrote to me? The shift in his expression was small but unmistakable, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional adjustment to his posture. These things develop gradually, he said. I see. She kept her voice level. You sent 2 weeks ago, confirming my arrival date when you wrote that. Had they already developed? Around them, the people who had come to see the arrival of Walter Crane's mail-order bride had gone very quiet. The station master had found something to study on his clipboard. The 2 men sitting on the depot bench had stopped their conversation. A woman near the door of the waiting room was watching with the specific attentiveness of someone planning to remember every word. Walter's jaw tightened. He had not evidently expected her to do arithmetic in public. I tried to handle this situation with dignity, he said, his voice dropping. I'm offering you a fair way out. You're offering me the money to leave, Evelyn said. That isn't dignity. That's disposal. That was when he counted out the coins. She looked at the $7.50 on the platform for a long moment. She had $7 of her own left. $15 total if she took his money. She did the arithmetic on her train fare back to Cincinnati, more than $10. Certainly. Perhaps more. And then what? Return to a city where she had already sold everything. Go to her cousin in Philadelphia. Write more letters to men she hadn't met, in towns she'd never seen. She bent down and picked up her valise. She did not pick up the coins. Keep your money, Mr. Crane, she said. I don't want anything from you. She picked up her hat box and walked to the far end of the platform and sat down on a bench in the weak October sunlight and opened her valise and took out a small notebook and began, in careful handwriting, to calculate what she had and what she could reasonably do with it. She was not going to cry in front of Walter Crane or any of the people he knew. She was not going to cry at all, in fact, if she could possibly help it. She had already done her crying in the Cincinnati train station at 2 a.m. alone, and she considered that debt paid. What she had was $7. What she needed was a plan. The problem with the plan was that she could not immediately find one. Redstone Creek was not a large town. It sat at the base of a long valley where 2 mountain ranges angled together, and the creek itself red-brown from iron sediment. Cold enough to hurt, even in summer, ran along the eastern edge of the main street. There were perhaps 200 people in town, and another 100 or so on the surrounding ranches and homesteads. There was one hotel, one boarding house, a saloon, a church, the dry goods store that Walter Crane owned, a blacksmith, a small doctor's office, and a school that doubled as a meeting hall. Evelyn had learned most of this from Walter's letters, which she was now discovering had been the most useful thing about him. Employment, that was the question. What could she do in Redstone Creek that someone would pay her for? She had run her father's shop accounts for 7 years and was competent with figures. She could sew, though not exceptionally. She could cook adequately. She could teach. She had some education, more than most women her age, because her father had believed in it, but the school already had a teacher. She was sitting with her notebook open and her handwriting getting increasingly small as she compressed her options into a shrinking space when she became aware that someone was watching her. She looked up. The man standing about 15 feet away on the platform was tall, genuinely tall, not the ordinary height that men sometimes called tall, but the kind that made the space around him seem proportioned differently. He wore the clothes of a working rancher, nothing fashionable, and he was somewhere between 40 and 45, with the weathered, angular face of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, and very little of it sleeping well. He had been standing there long enough that he must have seen most of what had happened with Walter. His expression was not pity. It was not amusement. She couldn't immediately name it. He looked away when she met his eyes, which she respected. A man who stared you down when you were already humiliated had a particular kind of character. A man who looked away gave you something back. She went back to her notebook. She had narrowed the situation down to 2 options: approach the hotel about laundry work, or ask whether the boarding house needed any kind of help when Walter Crane came back. He crossed the platform toward her with the specific walk of a man who had talked himself into believing he was being generous. He had the coins in his hand again. Miss Hart. He stopped in front of her. I'd like you to reconsider. I've spoken to Mrs. Alderman at the boarding house, and she says she can fit you for 2 nights. That plus this money would give you time to make proper arrangements. Evelyn closed her notebook. Did you tell Mrs. Alderman why I'm in need of accommodations? I told her there had been a change in circumstances. I see. She put the notebook in her valise. And what does Mrs. Alderman charge per night? 50 cents. So you've arranged for me to spend your money on a boarding house so that I'll be gone in 2 days, and the situation will feel resolved. She looked at him. That's very efficient, Mr. Crane. Walter's face reddened. I am trying to help you. No, she kept her voice even. You're trying to feel better about what you did. Those are different things. She was aware, peripherally, that there were several people within clear hearing distance now. The woman by the waiting room door had moved closer. The station master was no longer pretending to study his clipboard. Walter lowered his voice. You are making this more difficult than it needs to be. You wrote to me, Evelyn said. You asked me to come here. You confirmed my arrival date 2 weeks ago. I sold everything I had to make this journey. The difficulty isn't something I made. It's something you caused, and you don't want to have to stand in front of these people and fully account for that. I understand the feeling, but I'm not going to take your money to make you more comfortable with yourself. Walter stared at her. She could see in the shift of his expression the moment when he stopped seeing a problem to be managed and started seeing a person who was genuinely not going to behave the way he had expected. You have no plan, he said. It came out harder than he probably intended. You have no connections here. No family. No, that's enough. The voice came from the far end of the platform, and it was quiet, not raised, not theatrical, but it had the particular quality that made everyone within 30 feet stop talking at once. The tall rancher who had been watching earlier walked toward them with the unhurried stride of a man who moved slowly because he didn't need to move fast to get where he was going. He stopped between Evelyn and Walter with about 2 feet between himself and Walter, which was close enough to be meaningful. He said, You made your decision. You don't need to stand here and explain it. Walter drew himself up. Boone, this doesn't concern you. You're right, the rancher Boone said. It's your business, not mine. He paused. But you've been conducting it at some volume on a public platform for about 20 minutes now, which makes it somewhat harder to stay uninvolved. The Lacey is simply being unreasonable, the lady, Boone said, in a tone that was not particularly warm. Traveled 11 days on a train because you wrote her a letter. Being displeased about the reception seems reasonable to me. Walter's face had gone from red to a deep, unpleasant maroon. He looked between Boone and Evelyn with the expression of a man who had walked into a situation he no longer controlled, and was now calculating how to leave it without further damage to his reputation. I was trying to help her, he said. Then stop helping her, Boone said. Go back to your store. There was a long, airless moment. Then Walter pocketed the coins, straightened his coat, and walked off the platform without another word. The people watching drifted back toward their business. The woman by the waiting room door walked away, and Evelyn could hear her already talking. The kind of low, rapid talking that meant the story was already becoming something that would reach every household in Redstone Creek by supper time. Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the place where Walter had been standing. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, the rancher said. I only made him stop talking. I didn't solve your problem. He paused. Do you have a plan? I had several possibilities. She looked up at him. Before I could fully evaluate them, I was interrupted. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. Fair enough. He was quiet for a moment, looking at some middle distance over her left shoulder in the way that people do, when they're thinking about something they're not sure they want to say. I have a ranch, 3 miles north up the valley. It's been running short on household staff since for a while. I could use someone who can manage the kitchen and keep the house in order. 3 months. Wages are $12 a month, plus room and board. After 3 months, you decide what you want to do next, but at least you'd have time and money to make that choice yourself. Evelyn looked at him carefully. He was not an easy man to read. The face had too much weather on it, and the eyes were the sort of dark gray that gave away very little. But he had stepped between her and Walter Crane without being asked, and he had made Walter leave without once raising his voice, and the terms he was describing were straightforward. Why, she asked. Why what? Why offer me the position? You don't know me. I could be entirely unsuited to the work. You could be, he agreed. But Walter Crane wrote you a letter promising you a life and then changed his mind when you arrived. The least the county can do is offer you a fair wage while you figure out what to do about it. It was, she thought, an odd kind of answer. Not a reassurance. Not a sales pitch. Just a statement of what he thought was reasonable. My name is Evelyn Hart, she said. Gideon Boone. He didn't offer his hand, which in 1878 was the appropriate restraint. I'll have my man bring the wagon around if you're willing. Whenever you're ready, she looked at her notebook. She looked at her valise and her hat box and the platform of Redstone Creek, Colorado. and the mountains behind the town that were already getting their first thin cover of snow, even in October. She had come to this valley for a life. She had not specified whose life or which one, only that it had to be built from something real. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. "I'd like to write a letter." The letter was to her cousin in Philadelphia. It was brief. It said that her plans had changed somewhat, that she was well and had found employment, and that she would write more when she knew more. It did not mention Walter Crane by name. It did not sound, she read it back carefully, like a woman who had been publicly humiliated and was living by improvisation. It sounded like a woman who was managing her own affairs. She gave it to the station master to post and walked back across the platform to where Gideon Boone's man, a lean, quiet Mexican named Abelino, who appeared to be somewhere between 60 and impossible to accurately age, was loading her luggage into a wagon with the kind of care that suggested he had been told to be careful with it. Gideon was standing at the edge of the platform, looking up the valley. He had his hat in his hands, and his hair, dark brown going gray at the temples, was being taken apart by the mountain wind, which he appeared not to notice. "I should tell you, Evelyn," said, coming to stand beside him at a respectable distance, "that I have not been a housekeeper before. I've managed a household my father's, but not in any formal capacity." "I know," Gideon said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because you were going to marry Walter Crane. Men who write for housekeepers advertise for housekeepers. Men who write for wives are looking for something else." He put his hat back on. "I'm not expecting you to know how to do everything. I'm expecting you to try to learn what you don't know, and tell me honestly when something is beyond you. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. "Good." He stepped down off the platform toward the wagon. "Then let's go." The road north from Redstone Creek followed the creek for the first mile, and then climbed slightly toward the eastern side of the valley, where the land had better drainage, and the grass stayed greener longer into autumn. Evelyn sat in the wagon beside Abelino, who drove with the ease of a man who had made this particular journey several hundred times and saw no reason to hurry it. Gideon rode ahead on a big gray horse that moved with the deliberate, steady pace of a working animal rather than a showy one. The mountains were very close here. That was the first thing she truly absorbed, not in the intellectual way she had known from the map she had studied before coming west, but in the immediate physical way of sitting in a wagon with no building between her and them. They were enormous in a way that made her feel calibrated differently. Smaller in some ways, steadier in others. "You are the mail order lady," Abelino said. "It was not a question. I was," she said. "Now I'm the housekeeper." He appeared to consider this for Mr. Boone. "It is different work." "Different how?" "Mr. Crane's shop," Abelino said, "is clean, organized, comfortable. Everything is where it should be." He paused. "Mr. Boone's house." He made a small sound that she couldn't quite interpret. "It is less like that." "In what way?" Abelino appeared to select his words carefully. "In many ways." She looked at the mountains. She thought about the notebook in her valise, and about the numbers she had been calculating on the platform, and about $12 a month and 3 months, and what she might be able to do with $36 and a clear head. "All right," she said. They rode in silence for a while. The valley around them was the kind of landscape that seemed larger than it had any right to be, as if the space between the mountain ranges was somehow more than the sum of the distance. A hawk was working a thermal above the creek, making slow, patient circles. Cattle were visible in a lower pasture to the west. "How long have you worked for Mr. Boone?" she asked. 21 years, Abelino said. "And before him?" "His father." Abelino let that sit, this family, a long time. She looked at Gideon's back, ahead of them on the road. The broad shoulders, the careful, unhurried way he rode. Something the set of his back that she recognized, not happiness. Exactly. The posture of a person who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that they'd stopped noticing the weight. "Is he a fair man?" she asked. "To work for?" Abelino was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Then he is a difficult man," he said, "but a fair one. There is a difference." The ranch house appeared at the end of a long drive lined with cottonwood trees that had already gone yellow and were beginning to shed. It was a substantial structure, 2 stories, the covered porch running the full length of the front, but it had the particular look of a house that was maintained rather than cared for. The paint on the window trim was peeling. One shutter hung at an angle that suggested its hinge had given way some months ago. The porch had a chair with a broken back propped against the railing. Functional, Evelyn thought, but hollowed out, the way a house gets when there's no one inside it who loves it. Her ranch hands visible. 2 men working near a far corral, one crossing the yard toward the barn. They looked at the wagon with varying degrees of curiosity. One of them, a younger man with red hair and a pronounced jaw, stared at Evelyn with the specific expression of someone who had heard the story of the morning and was trying to reconcile the story with the person. She met his eyes for precisely a second and then looked away. She had learned, in the months since her father died, how to make it clear that she was aware of being looked at without acknowledging that it bothered her. It was a skill. She was still perfecting it. Gideon dismounted and tied his horse at the post near the porch steps. He looked at the house, and then at her with the same expression she'd seen on the platform, that particular combination of seeing clearly and not quite knowing what to do about it. "It needs work," he said, "not an apology, a statement." "I can see that," she said. "Kitchen's the worst of it. I had a woman from town coming twice a week, but she stopped in August, and I haven't." He paused. "It's gotten away from me, all right." She picked up her valise. "I'll take a look." She went up the porch steps and in through the front door without waiting for him to show her the way. She felt his eyes on her back as she went, and she felt the slight surprise in them, not offended. Just surprised, and she understood that he had expected her to be more tentative, more grateful, more aware of the strangeness of her situation. She was aware of the strangeness of her situation. She was carrying it with her at every moment. But she had found that the best thing to do with strangeness was to move through it, not to stand at the edge of it and wait for it to become familiar. The kitchen was bad. Not unsalvageable, she had seen that immediately, walking through the door, but bad. The stove needed cleaning, and the flue adjusted. There were grease deposits on the walls beside the stove that had built up over what looked like months of neglect. The flour bins were nearly empty, and one had a thin crack in the lid that would let moisture in. The root cellar, when she found the door and opened it, was poorly organized vegetables mixed together without separation so that the ones going bad were affecting the ones that weren't. She stood in the kitchen for several minutes taking inventory, not just of the work, but of the space where the light came from, what the stove's limitations were, what could be fixed quickly, and what would take time. Then she went back out to the porch where Gideon was still standing, one hand on the post, looking at the mountains. "I'll need supplies from town," she said. "Probably within the next few days. I can make a list." He looked at her. "That's it? What else is there?" "Most people who walked through that kitchen came back and told me they couldn't work in it," he said. "Mrs. Denham, the woman who came twice a week, she told me it was impossible before she stopped coming." "It isn't impossible," Evelyn said. "It's just neglected. Neglected things can be fixed. The flue on the stove is the most important thing until that's adjusted. Cooking anything produces too much smoke, and you're wasting fuel. Once that's done, the rest is labor." Gideon was watching her with an expression she was beginning to understand. It was not warmth exactly. It was attention. The specific attention of someone who had expected one thing and encountered another, and was reassessing. "Abelino can drive you to town for supplies whenever you need," he said. "Account it to the ranch, I'll settle it. Thank you." She turned to go back inside. "Miss Hart." She stopped. "You didn't have to come back out and tell me," he said. "You could have just started working." "I could have," she agreed. "But you're my employer. You should know what state things are in and what I intend to do about it. Most people who work for me don't think that way. Most people who work for you probably didn't spend the morning being told their life's been refunded on a train platform," she said. "I find that sort of thing makes a person clear-eyed about what matters." She went back inside. She didn't hear him move for a long moment. Then she heard his boots on the porch steps and the sound of him walking toward the barn. The room she was given was on the upper floor, at the far end of the hall from what was clearly the main bedroom. It was small, a bed, a wash, a chest of drawers, a window facing east. The mattress was thin but clean. The window had a crack in one pane that had been stuffed with wadded cloth, which kept the cold out but meant the glass was obscured. She unpacked her valise and her hat box with the methodical care of a person who has limited possessions and treats them accordingly. She put her grandmother's photograph on the chest of drawers. Her grandmother, a small, dry woman from Pennsylvania, who had crossed 3 state lines as a young widow and built herself a reasonable life on the other sides, had been the first person to tell her that competence was better than beauty. Because beauty was temporary and competence compounded. Evelyn had been 14 when her grandmother said that and had not fully understood it. She understood it now. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself be still for a moment. Really still. Not the controlled stillness she had been performing all day on the platform and in the wagon and in the kitchen, but the actual stillness of exhaustion. She had come to Redstone Creek to marry a man who had decided she wasn't worth the trouble. She had instead taken employment with a man she didn't know, in a house she'd never seen, in a town that would spend the next several weeks talking about her. Her total financial position was $7 and whatever she could earn in the next 3 months. She had no way home that she could afford, no family that could help her, and no plan beyond the immediate next step. And yet, she looked at the crack in the window glass and the fading afternoon light coming through it, and she thought about the kitchen and the flue and the flour bins, and she thought about the look on Gideon Boone's face when she had said, simply, "It isn't impossible, it's just neglected." There was something here. She didn't know what it was yet, but there was something. She got up from the bed, went to the washstand, splashed water on her face, dried it, and went downstairs to start on the stove. Dinner that first night was simple. She found enough in the root cellar and the near-empty pantry to make a stew that was at least hot and filling, even if it lacked any particular distinction. She set it on the table in the main kitchen with bread that she'd found in the bread box and warmed on the stove. Gideon came in from outside, washed his hands at the pump, and sat down across the kitchen table from where she'd placed the pot. He looked at the stew. He looked at the bread. He picked up his spoon. The red-haired ranch hand appeared in the doorway, stopped, and looked at the table with an expression of muted surprise. "There a reason you're standing in the door, Pete?" Gideon said without looking up. "No, sir," Pete said. "Just smelled something." He disappeared. Gideon ate in silence for a while. Evelyn sat with a smaller portion at the far end of the table, eating with her attention on her bowl and the mental list of what she needed to do tomorrow and the day after. "Stove flue," Gideon said after several minutes. "Did you adjust it?" "Partway," she said. "It needs a new seal on one of the joints I made do for tonight, but it'll need to be properly done. Is there someone in town who can do it? Or is that Abellino's work?" "Abellino," Gideon said. "He can do it. I'll ask him in the morning." She looked up. "The flour situation will also need addressing soon. I found some reserves in the back of the pantry, but they're aging. I can manage for a week, but after that, write the list," Gideon said. "I told you, account it to the ranch, I know. I just want you to know what I'm planning to spend and why. I don't think it's reasonable for you to pay for things without knowing what they are and what they're for." Gideon looked at her across the table with that same quality of attention, the reassessment, the not-quite naming of whatever he was seeing. "That's not how it usually works," he said. "Usually I just get presented with expenses." "Well," she looked back at her bowl. "That seems inefficient." He ate. She ate. The wind moved outside, the mountains still visible through the kitchen window in the last light, their upper slopes dark and enormous and indifferent. "You held yourself well today," he said finally. "On the platform." When Crane he stopped. "That took something." "Took everything I had," she said honestly. "But I had it." Gideon looked at the table for a moment. Then he picked up his bread. "Get some sleep when you're done," he said. "If you're going to adjust the whole kitchen by Thursday, you'll need it." It was not the warmest thing anyone had ever said to her. It was also, she recognized, something closer to real respect than anything Walter Crane had ever put in 3 pages of careful letters. She picked up her bread. Outside, the wind pushed at the cottonwood trees, and the last light failed against the mountains, and Redstone Creek moved on into another evening. She had a plan now, or at least the beginning of one. That would do for today. The stove flue took Abellino the better part of Thursday morning to reseal, and while he worked, Evelyn moved around him with the focused efficiency of a woman who had decided that standing still was a form of surrender. She had been at the Boone Ranch for 2 days. In those 2 days, she had reorganized the root cellar, identified which of the pantry reserves were still usable and which needed to be discarded, scrubbed the grease from the wall beside the stove until her arms ached and the bricks showed clean underneath, and made a list of 14 items she needed from town. She had not cried. She had come close, once late the first night, sitting on the edge of the thin mattress in the dark, listening to the wind work at the cracked window pane and thinking about Cincinnati, about the sewing machine she had sold and whether the woman who bought it was using it well. But she had pressed the feeling flat and gone to sleep and woken before dawn and gone downstairs to start the fire. And the feeling had been smaller by morning and smaller still by the following day. The way grief tends to behave when you give it no room to spread. The kitchen, by Thursday afternoon, was beginning to look like a place where food was made, rather than a place where food was abandoned. Abellino finished his work on the flue and ran a test fire and declared the draw acceptable, which, from a man who chose his words the way a careful person chooses from a limited supply, Evelyn had come to understand meant genuinely good. "Better than it has been in 2 years," he told her, with one hand on the stovepipe, and his head tilted the way a doctor listens to a chest. "Has it been 2 years since the kitchen was properly managed?" she asked. Abellino considered. "Mrs. Boone died 3 years ago," he said carefully. "It has been 2 years since anyone tried in a serious way." Evelyn filed this information in the part of her mind where she stored things she hadn't been told directly, but needed to understand. Gideon's mother. A household that had once been run by a woman who cared about it, and had not been properly cared for since. That explained certain things, the specific quality of the neglect, which was not the neglect of indifference, but the neglect of absence. The house didn't feel unloved. It felt like it was waiting. She did not say any of this to Abellino. She thanked him for his work on the flue and went back to her list. Pete, the red-haired ranch hand who had appeared in the kitchen doorway the first evening, turned out to be 23 years old from Missouri, and constitutionally unable to leave a silence unfilled. He appeared in Evelyn's vicinity with a frequency that she initially found irritating, and then gradually recognized as a kind of rough helpfulness. He carried the reorganized root cellar stores when she asked without being asked twice. He found the garden tools in the barn when she mentioned the kitchen garden, and brought them around to the back of the house without her needing to specify which tools or where they were stored. "You rode up with Mr. Boone from the depot," he said on the third day, leaning against the kitchen doorframe while she assessed the kitchen garden, with the specific depression of someone confronting winter weeds. "I did," she said, after that business with Mr. Crane. After that business with Mr. Crane, she agreed. "Must have been rough," Pete said. It was not phrased as a question, but it carried the shape of one, the specific shape of a young person who wants to ask something direct and is working up to it. "It was not my best morning," Evelyn said. "Mr. Boone doesn't usually get involved in things like that. He keeps to himself mostly, about town matters." Pete paused. "The boys in the bunkhouse think it's because Crane's had it coming for a while." She stopped and looked at him. "What do you mean?" Pete shifted his weight. "Nothing specific. Just there are people in Redstone Creek who think Mr. Crane is not always what he presents himself as, in business, I mean. I don't mean to gossip." "Then don't," she said, not unkindly. "But if you know something that might be relevant to my situation, that's different from gossip." Pete thought about this with the serious deliberation of someone who had not previously considered the distinction. "I think Mr. Boone might know more about it than I do," he said finally. "I only hear things." Evelyn looked back at the kitchen garden. The soil was hard, and the weeds had gone woody with the cold, which meant pulling them would be a genuine battle. She picked up the hand fork. "Tell me what you hear, Pete." "I'm not going to repeat it," he told her. "It took about 10 minutes and involved a land dispute from 4 years ago, a loan that several families in the valley had taken from Walter Crane during a bad cattle season, and some question about the terms of those loans and whether they matched what had been verbally agreed. Nothing proven. Nothing that had gone to court. Just the particular low current of unease that runs through a small community when someone powerful has done something that everyone suspects but nobody can name precisely." Evelyn listened. She dug at the weeds. She did not comment, because she was not in a position yet to comment. She was 9 days into a life she was still learning the geography of, and making judgments about men she hadn't yet fully observed seemed premature. But she stored it alongside the other things she was storing, in the careful mental filing system of a woman who had learned that the difference between a situation you can manage and one that manages you is usually just information. The library was Abellino's fault in a way. He had mentioned offhand, when he was showing her where the linen closet was, that the room at the back of the house past the main staircase was kept locked. "Kept locked how?" she asked. "Mr. Boone keeps the key," Abellino said. It was Mrs. Boone's room, her reading room. He paused. He locked it after she passed. Evelyn had walked past that door several times in her first week without trying it, because trying a locked door in someone else's house before you'd earned any standing there seemed like overreach. By the end of the second week, though, she had noticed a gap under the door, just a thin edge of dust and darkness, and the specific smell that comes from rooms full of paper when the temperature drops. A distinctive smell. She knew it from her father's shop, from the back room where he kept the ledgers, from every library she had ever been in. Paper and binding and time. She mentioned it to Gideon on a Thursday evening when he came in from checking the far fence lines and sat down at the kitchen table with the particular heaviness of a man who had been in the saddle too long. She set his coffee in front of him. She had learned by the second week how he took it, which was black and strong and not particularly hot, which seemed to her a regrettable choice but was not her business, and said, without sitting down, "The back room." He looked up from the table. "What about it?" "Abellino told me what it is. I wanted to ask you directly about it rather than make assumptions." She met his eyes. "There's a draft coming through the gap under the door. In this weather, and with paper, if there are books in there, they need some air circulation or they'll mold over winter. I'm not suggesting I go in. I'm suggesting the door should be open periodically, and the room checked." Gideon looked at his coffee cup. He turned it in his hands, which was a thing she had noticed he did when he was thinking through something he didn't want to think through. "My mother collected books," he said, "her whole life. She had shelves built in there, full wall. Brought them from Virginia when she came west with my father in '49. He paused. "I haven't been in that room since she died." Evelyn sat down. Not because she had planned to, but because standing over him while he said this seemed wrong. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with the room," she said. "That's yours. But if you want me to air it and make sure nothing's deteriorating, I can do that without disturbing anything." He was quiet for a long moment. "You'd need the key," he said. Yes, another silence. The fire in the stove worked steadily. Outside, the wind had picked up. It came off the mountains in October with a particular personality, Not malicious exactly, but insistent, the way winter makes its intentions clear before it arrives. "I'll think about it," Gideon said. She did not push. She got up and went back to the stove. 3 days later, a key appeared on the kitchen windowsill. It was old iron, attached to a piece of cord, and it had been placed very precisely in the center of the sill, where she would see it, but where it could also have been accidental. She picked it up, went to the back room, unlocked the door, and opened it. The room was extraordinary. 2 walls entirely shelved and filled, the books organized with the careful attention of someone who had loved them not alphabetically, not by color, but by some system that revealed itself gradually as she looked. Themes and subjects loosely grouped, histories near geographies, novels near poetry, with a whole long section on the natural sciences that showed the particular passion of a curious mind. There was a reading chair in the corner, angled toward the window, with a small table beside it, and the ghost of a woman's presence so strong in the arrangement of things that Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment and simply let herself feel it. She did not disturb the arrangement. She opened the window 2 inches to let the cold, fresh air move through, and she checked each shelf for signs of mold or water damage. There was none. The room had been better sealed than she had feared, and she made a note of which volumes showed cracked spines or loose bindings that could be repaired. When she relocked the door and put the key back on the windowsill that evening, Gideon looked at it and looked at her and looked away. "How is it?" he asked. "Beautiful," she said. She had wonderful taste. He picked up the key and put it in his pocket. He did not say anything else. But the following Sunday morning, she found him in that room when she came to air it, sitting in the reading chair with a book open in his hands. He did not look up when she entered, and she did not speak to him, and she aired the room and left as quietly as she had come. It was the first time she had seen him somewhere in the house that felt inhabited rather than merely occupied. The ranch hands, by the end of the 3rd week, had stopped treating her presence like a temporary and slightly awkward situation, and had begun treating it like a fact. This was, she had learned over the years, the only real measure of whether you belonged somewhere, not whether people were polite to you, but whether they stopped adjusting their behavior to account for you. There were 6 of them, Pete, who talked. Darnell, who was 40 and taciturn and the best writer of the group, a pair of brothers named Hatch and Clement, who were from Tennessee, and had a running argument that appeared to have been ongoing for most of their lives, a quiet, very young man named Tomas, who was Abelino's nephew, and who Evelyn suspected was learning more than ranch work, and an older hand called Royce, who had been on the Boone spread for 7 years, and who regarded Evelyn's organizational activities with the specific wariness of someone who has gotten comfortable with a certain level of disorder. Royce was her most persistent challenge in that first month. He was not hostile exactly. He was strategically skeptical. He appeared in the kitchen at odd hours in ways that seemed designed to catch the household management in some state of inadequacy. He pointed out, with the precision of a man who had been waiting to point it out, that the way she had reorganized the pantry made certain things harder to locate quickly. "Which things?" she asked. "The salt," he said. "It was always in the upper left. Now it's on the 2nd shelf. It's on the 2nd shelf because it's heavy," she said. "Heavy things should be at mid-height, not overhead. If someone reaches for it in a hurry and knocks it, at that height it could." She stopped herself. "But I understand muscle memory. Would it help if I labeled the shelves?" Royce looked at the pantry shelves. He looked at her. He had the weathered, slightly combative expression of a man who has arrived prepared for a fight and found his opponent doing something reasonable instead. "I don't need labels to find salt," he said. "No," she agreed. "But some of the other men might find it useful." She labeled the shelves. Royce stopped complaining about the salt. He was never precisely warm toward her, but there came a day in late October when she saw him explaining the label system to Tomas with the authority of someone who had originated the idea, and she understood that was, under the circumstances, the closest thing to approval she was going to get. What she hadn't accounted for was the accident. It was a Tuesday in the 4th week of November, and the temperature had dropped sharply overnight, and the ground had that particular iron quality that comes just before it freezes solid. She was in the kitchen doing the morning bread when she heard Pete shouting from the yard, not the ordinary shouting of work, but the high, specific urgency of someone for whom ordinary shouting will not do. She was out the back door before she had time to think about it. The scene in the far corner of the yard near the fence post told her most of what she needed to know in the first second. A horse that had clearly spooked badly, now being held by Darnell, Tomas on the ground, Hatch and Clement kneeling beside him, and Pete running toward the house, toward her, with his face the color of old chalk. "He came off the fence post wrong when the horse went sideways," Pete said, reaching her. "His arm, you can see it's wrong. And his head, he hit the fence rail on the way down. There's blood." "How bad is the head?" she asked, already moving toward the group. "I don't a lot," Pete said. Go inside and bring me the cloths from the second drawer in the kitchen, the clean ones, and the bottle of carbolic from the washroom. There's a bottle on the upper shelf, brown glass. Bring it all quickly. She reached Tomas in about 30 seconds. He was conscious, which was the first thing she checked, conscious and confused, which could mean several things, some of them serious. He was 19 years old and trying to sit up, which told her his instincts were working even if his judgment was not. Don't sit up, she said, kneeling beside him. Stay still. I need to look at you. The arm was clearly broken, the lower portion at an angle that made Clement look away and Hatch swear under his breath. The head wound was at the left temple, a deep gash from the fence rail, bleeding with the specific insistence of scalp wounds, which bleed dramatically regardless of depth but needed to be assessed carefully for what lay beneath. She pressed both her palms flat on the ground and breathed for exactly 1 second. Her grandmother had taught her this. Not the medical part specifically, her grandmother had not been a doctor, but the particular discipline of making your hands steady before you use them for something that matters. Her grandmother had set 2 broken fingers and stitched a gash across a farmhand's palm and done it both times without flinching, and she had told Evelyn that the secret was simply to decide you were going to do it before you started, so that your hands didn't have to make the decision mid-task. Evelyn's had set 1 broken finger in her adult life on her father's right hand after a workshop accident, and she had watched a doctor treat a head wound once in Cincinnati. She was not a doctor, she knew this. But the doctor was 3 miles away in town, and the nearest other competent person was Abelino, who was somewhere on the south fence, and a scalp wound that kept bleeding needed pressure and assessment now, not in an hour. Pete arrived with the cloths and the carbolic. She took them without looking up. Someone needs to ride for the doctor, she said. I'll go, Darnell said, already moving toward the corral. Tell him head wound, left temple, significant bleeding, patient is conscious but disoriented, and a broken forearm. Tell him which arm, Tomas. Right, Tomas said, with the focused effort of someone working hard to remain part of their own situation. Right forearm, she called after Darnell. Tell him that. Then she turned back to the wound. She cleaned it with the carbolic-soaked cloth, which made Tomas hiss through his teeth and try to pull back, and she said firmly but not harshly, I know. Hold still. He held still. The wound was deep but not complicated, no visible bone, no depression under the skull that would have indicated a fracture, the bleeding aggressive but slowing under pressure. She had seen enough in her father's shop, where accidents with tools were not uncommon, to know the difference between a wound that was urgent and one that was critical. This was urgent. The arm was worse because there was nothing she could do to properly reduce a broken forearm in the field that needed the doctor, but she could stabilize it, and she could do it in a way that would minimize the movement and pain on the ride, or wait for the doctor. She used the remaining clean cloths and a straight piece of wood that Hatch found near the fence to brace it, tying it with a firmness that would hold. Throughout all of this, she was aware of the men watching her, not with the watching of people who expected her to fail that had been Pete's face at the beginning, that specific kind of helpless hoping, but with the watching of people revising and understanding. She could feel it at the edge of her attention, the way you feel a change in the air before weather. She was also aware of Gideon. He had appeared at some point during the arm stabilization. She hadn't seen him arrive. She had been focused on Tomas, and he was standing back from the group, not intervening, just watching. His face had a quality she hadn't seen on it before. She didn't have time to examine it. She kept working. The doctor arrived 50 minutes later, which was faster than 3 miles should have allowed. He was a thin man named Whitfield who clearly rode as well as he doctored, and he came into the situation with the brisk economy of someone who has seen a great deal and stopped being surprised by most of it. He assessed the head wound, examined her cleaning and compression work, and said, without inflection, good. Then he examined the arm, her splinting, and the angle of support she'd used, and said, where did you learn to do this? My grandmother, Evelyn said. She wasn't a doctor. No, Whitfield said, already turning to his bag. She wasn't an idiot either. He looked at her over his shoulder. I'm going to set the arm. I need someone to hold him still. Are you able? Yes, she said. She held Tomas still while the doctor set the arm, and she talked to him throughout not about what was happening, because that would not have helped, but about Missouri, which he had mentioned once being from, asking him about it in the specific way that requires someone to focus outward. It was not a technique. It was something her grandmother had done instinctively when her grandfather was ill, and Evelyn had watched it work and remembered it, and it worked now. Tomas focused on Missouri. The arm was set. He went pale and then came back, and the doctor bound it, and declared the head wound less serious than it had initially appeared, with the caveat that he was to be watched through the night for changes in coherence or consciousness. You'll watch him? Whitfield said to Evelyn. Yes, she said. The doctor glanced at Gideon, who was now standing near the fence with Abelino. Whitfield had clearly been to the Boone Ranch before, and clearly knew Gideon, and the glance between them communicated something Evelyn couldn't fully read. Then Whitfield packed his bag and rode back toward town, and Evelyn organized the movement of Tomas into the bunkhouse where she could check on him easily, and gave Pete and Hatch instructions on what to watch for and when to come and get her. She was washing her hands at the pump when Gideon came up behind her. She heard him stop. She finished washing her hands and dried them on the hem of her apron and turned around. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen while she was working on Tomas, the one she hadn't had time to examine. She examined it now. It was not pity and it was not gratitude, and it was not the complicated social performance of a man acknowledging that a woman has done something unexpected. It was something simpler and more serious than any of those. It was the look of a person recognizing another person. "You've done that before," he said. "Not exactly that," she said, "but close enough." "Where did you learn?" "My grandmother." She was a practical woman. She didn't have formal training in anything, but she believed that knowledge was for using, not for keeping respectable. Evelyn looked at her hands. "Clean now, the morning's work invisible." "My father was the same way. He taught me the shop accounts when I was 10 because he said it was better to know something useful than to know something decorative." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "She might have died in Cincinnati," he said. "Someone like you, working in someone else's house for less than I'm paying you, doing nothing that needed whatever that was." It was not a romantic statement. It was not a compliment, exactly. It was an observation made by a man who was accustomed to looking at land and animals and making direct assessments of what he saw. "I didn't die in Cincinnati," she said. "I'm here." "Yes," he said, "you are." He walked back toward the barn. She looked at the mountains for a moment, the way they sat against the sky with their cold, absolute permanence. Then she went inside to start on the afternoon bread, because Tomas needed to eat something soft when he was ready, and the bread would take 2 hours. November became December slowly, the way seasons turn in mountain country, not with a single dramatic shift, but with an accumulation of small changes that you notice in retrospect. The cold settled into the bones of the house, and Evelyn found where the drafts came from and packed them, and added an extra quilt to Gideon's linen order and 2 more for the bunkhouse without being asked. And this was noticed and not commented on, which she understood was its own kind of acceptance. She had fallen into a rhythm with the house that was almost involuntary by now, not the rigid routine of someone following a schedule, but the organic rhythm of someone who had understood the household well enough to move with it. The stove needed feeding at certain hours. The root cellar needed checking weekly. The bread worked better with the flue open a quarter turn. Gideon's coffee went on 20 minutes before he came in from morning rounds, not earlier, because he disliked it when it sat too long. She learned these things the way you learn the pattern of a difficult piece of terrain, not by studying it, but by crossing it repeatedly until the crossings became automatic. What she hadn't expected was to find herself thinking about him, not in the tender, cautious way of a woman protecting herself from another disappointment. Just thinking about him the way you think about something that doesn't fit neatly into the categories you have for it. He was not what she had expected from the platform in Redstone Creek, not in the obvious ways. He was not warm or particularly easy to talk to, or given to the kind of social performance that made people feel welcome. But he was consistent, which was rarer than warmth and more valuable in the long run. And he was honest, not with the blunt, self-congratulatory honesty of people who think directness absolves them of care, but with a quieter kind, the honesty of someone who simply couldn't be bothered to construct a false version of things. She had told him, one afternoon in early December while they were both in the kitchen she working, he at the table with the ranch accounts, that the south pasture fence near the creek was showing wear in 3 places. She had seen it on her second week, walking the boundary of the kitchen garden, and had been waiting for the right moment to mention it without seeming to be cataloging his property. Gideon had looked up from his accounts. "You walked the south boundary?" "The part near the creek. I was checking on the kitchen garden." She paused. "I noticed the fence." 3 places," he said. 2 near the cottonwoods and 1 closer to the bend. The post near the bend is leaning." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the accounts, though she could tell he was no longer reading them. "Pete did the south fence inspection in September," he said. "He didn't report any of that." "He might not have gone all the way to the bend," she said neutrally, "or it might have worsened since September." Gideon set down his pencil. "Which post near the bend?" She described it precisely. He listened with his eyes on the table, the pencil in his fingers, and when she was finished, he picked the pencil back up and made a note in the margin of the account book, which was the system she had observed him use for things that needed to be carried forward. "I'll look at it tomorrow," he said. She went back to the stove. He went back to his accounts. The kitchen was warm and the window showed the December sky going dark. At 4 in the afternoon, the mountains barely visible through the early dark. "Miss Hart," he said after several minutes, "Mr. Boone." He seemed to debate something internally, visible in the brief stillness of his pencil. "This isn't what you planned for yourself," he said, "when you answered Crane's advertisement." "No," she said. "Isn't. Is it?" He stopped. "Try it again. Is it tolerable?" It was such a carefully chosen word. Not good or pleasant or satisfying. Tolerable. As if he had calibrated the question to ask for the smallest honest answer rather than risk being given a polite one. She thought about the kitchen, which she had made functional and clean, and was slowly making something better than functional. She thought about the library key on the windowsill, and about the morning she had found him in the reading chair. She thought about Tomas, who was healing well, and had taken to stopping by the kitchen in the evenings on the pretext of returning mugs, which was not a pretext anyone acknowledged. "More than tolerable," she said. He looked up from the accounts. She kept her attention on the stove. "Good," he said. He went back to his numbers. She went back to hers, the invisible ones, the running calculation of this life, what it contained and what it might become, the arithmetic she had started in a notebook on a train platform in Redstone Creek, and had not yet finished. The thing about December in the mountains was that it made the ranch smaller. The range that had seemed enormous in October contracted as the cold deepened and the days shortened, and the snow came not the paralyzing blizzard snow of the high country, but the steady, incremental snow of the valley, 2 or 3 inches at a time until the ground was consistently white, and the cottonwoods along the drive had gone from yellow to bare to white-limbed against the gray sky. The men moved between the bunkhouse and the barn and the main pastures, working shorter circuits, and Gideon's evenings grew longer by proximity. He came in earlier, sat at the table later, and the silence that had characterized those evenings in October had changed its quality without either of them naming the change. He had started talking to her, not about important things, not at first about the cattle count, about a conversation he'd had with a neighbor to the north about water rights, about whether a particular saddle in the tack room was worth repairing or should be replaced. Practical things. The language of people who are learning to speak the same dialect. She answered practically, because she had something to contribute. To most of it, she had been listening carefully for 2 months, learning the geography of this ranch and this valley, the way she had learned the kitchen, which was by paying attention to every specific detail until the whole became intelligible. Then, on a Thursday evening in mid-December, when the snow was coming down in the particular dense, quiet way that makes the world contract to the radius of whatever light you're standing in, he set down his coffee cup and said, "Unexpectedly, I should tell you about the loans." She set down what she was doing. She sat across the table from him, which she did not always do in the evenings. "What Crane lent to people in the valley," he said, "during the hard season in '74. 3 families, Hendersons, the Marlowe place, and a homesteader named Gifford who's on the East Ridge. He lent them money at terms he described verbally as 5% over 2 years. He turned his coffee cup. The written agreement said 8% over 18 months. They signed without reading carefully," she said. "Gifford couldn't read well," Gideon said. "The Hendersons trusted Crane because their fathers had done business together. The Marlowes," he stopped. "I don't know why the Marlowes didn't read it. Maybe they did read it and didn't understand what they were reading. And the difference in terms means they owe significantly more than they expected. It means the Marlowes are close to losing their land," he said flatly. "Gifford lost his last spring. He's working day labor now." He looked at the table. "I bought Gifford's land at fair value. I didn't let Crane take it at foreclosure price. But that doesn't fix the problem. Crane still has the paper on the Marlowes." Evelyn thought about Pete's careful hedging description of things he'd heard. She thought about the way Gideon had stepped onto the platform in Redstone Creek without being asked, and about the particular quality of the look he had given Walter Crane. She now understood was not simply disapproval of a broken social contract, but something older and more specific. "You've been watching him for a long time," she said. "Long enough." He picked up his cup. "I told you this because you asked in October why I offered you the position. I gave you the short answer. The whole answer includes the fact that Walter Crane has been doing damage to people in this valley for years, while maintaining that he is a respectable and generous man. And when I watched him stand on that platform and count coins at you," had he paused with the slight friction of a man choosing his words precisely, "I had strong feelings about it." "Strong feelings," she repeated, with a tone that was not quite dry but was in that direction. Something shifted in the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, still, but closer than she had seen before. "I'm not an eloquent man," he said. "You don't need to be eloquent," she said. "You just needed to offer me the position, and you did." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, with the winter dark pressed against the kitchen windows, and the snow still falling, in the particular silence of mountain snow. And for a moment neither of them said anything, and the moment had the specific quality of something balanced, not about to tip, but aware that tipping was possible. Then Gideon picked up his account book. "I'm going to talk to a lawyer in Durango after the new year," he said, "about the Marlowe situation. I thought you should know, since you seem to have been gathering information about Crane on your own." "Only what came to me naturally," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you." She went back to the bread she had been working on. He went back to his accounts. The snow kept falling. The lamp held. The kitchen was warm. She had come to Redstone Creek 2 months ago with nowhere to go, and no plan beyond the next 10 minutes. What she had now was different, not security exactly. Nothing as solid as that. But something real. Something she had built out of 14 items on a supply list and a stove flue and a library key on a windowsill and a young man's broken arm and one conversation at a time about practical things. That turned out not to be only about practical things. She had not thought, when she sat on that depot bench with her notebook, that this was where the arithmetic would lead. She thought about it now, kneading the bread dough with her hands, listening to Gideon turn a page in his account book, feeling the mountain cold against the windows, and the warmth inside the walls of this house that had been waiting, she thought, for someone to come back and inhabit it properly. Outside, the snow kept building, clean and indifferent, covering the long valley in white silence. Inside, the lamp burned. The arithmetic, she thought, was beginning to look different from what she had started with. The cattle were gone on a Monday morning in January, and Gideon knew it before he had fully crossed the south pasture because the silence was wrong. Cattle were not quiet animals. They moved and breathed and complained with a low, ongoing presence that a man learned to hear as background, after enough years the way you learn to hear a river, not as a specific sound but as a condition of the air. When Gideon rode the south fence line that Monday at first light and the air had only wind in it, he pulled up his horse and sat very still and counted what he could see. And what he could see was 30 head short of what should have been there. He rode back to the ranch at a pace that was controlled but not slow. Evelyn was at the stove when he came through the kitchen door, and she read his face before he said anything. She had been reading his face for 3 months now, which was long enough to know the difference between the closed expression of a man working through a problem and the closed expression of a man containing anger. This was the second kind. "How many?" she asked. He stopped. Looked at her. 30 head, south pasture. Since when? Overnight. The snow's been covered in places there was wind last night. I couldn't read the tracks clearly, but they came through the fence at the low corner, the one I repaired after you spotted it. Someone cut it after I fixed it. She took the coffee off the stove and poured it. She set it on the table. He sat down, not because he wanted to sit, but because standing in the kitchen with nowhere to direct himself was worse. "The low corner is the least visible from the road," she said. "Yes." He picked up the coffee and didn't drink it. Someone knew the property. She turned back to the stove. She did not offer reassurances or commentary on what he should feel about it. That was one of the things about Evelyn that Gideon had come to rely on without ever naming it. She understood when a situation called for information and practical thinking rather than consolation, and she did not confuse the two. "Darnell and Pete," he said, "I'm taking them and going after the herd. Abelino stays here with you and Tomas and Clement." "Hatch?" she asked. "Hatch comes with me. I need 4 men." She nodded. "How long? I don't know. Days, maybe. The tracks will go into the high country if they're smart, and they're smart enough to have cut the fence at night, so." He set the coffee down. "Abelino has the account book if anything from town needs settling." "I know where the account book is," she said. "Go find your cattle." He looked at her across the kitchen, and in the particular early morning light of January, with the snow still on the mountains visible through the window behind her, there was a quality to the moment that he noticed, and could not quite name and filed away in the part of himself where things went when he didn't yet have words for them. He went. The 3 days Gideon was gone were the longest Evelyn had spent since arriving in Redstone Creek, which surprised her, because she was a woman who had always been comfortable with her own company and had spent the previous year largely alone, and had considered this a skill rather than a deprivation. But the house felt different without him in it. Not empty. Abelino was there, and Tomas, who was still healing but mobile, and Clement, who was not Pete but was sufficiently present to fill space. The house was not empty. It felt waiting. She did not allow herself to examine this feeling too closely. She had work to do. The kitchen garden needed the winter. Covering checked after the wind. The bunkhouse needed the stove attended. There was mending backed up from the week before. She did the work with the focused energy of someone using occupation as architecture, building something to stand inside of rather than standing in open air. On the second day, Abelino told her what he knew about the men who ran cattle theft in the valley. He did not volunteer the information, she asked, because she had decided that knowing was better than not knowing, and Abelino respected the question enough to answer it. There had been for the past 2 years a loose operation moving stolen cattle through the mountain passes into New Mexico. Not a large organization, not the organized criminal enterprises of the Eastern Territories, but opportunistic and locally informed. Men who knew the ranches well enough to know which herds were poorly guarded and which fence lines were vulnerable. There had been losses at 2 other spreads in the past 6 months, the Henderson Ranch and a smaller homestead north of town. Nobody had been caught. Nobody had been able to describe clearly who was responsible. Though there were names that circulated in the way, names always circulate in small communities when people suspect but cannot prove. Crane? She asked. Abellino was quiet for a moment in the particular way that was not uncertainty but selection. There are men who work the road between here and Durango, he said. Men who need to know when to move and where to go and who is watching. That kind of information comes from somewhere. He did not say Walter Crane's name. He didn't need to. She sat with this for the rest of that afternoon, turning it the way you turn a problem in your hands, not trying to force a shape, but waiting for the shape to become apparent. She had come to this valley because a man had written her a letter promising a life and then withdrawn the promise. She had stayed because of $12 a month and a kitchen that needed fixing, and a decision she had made on a train platform about what kind of woman she was going to be. What she had not planned for, could not have planned for, was the way this valley and this ranch and the people in it had become something she had a stake in, not just professionally, but genuinely, in the way that you develop a stake in things you've invested actual care and effort in, regardless of whether they belong to you on paper. If Walter Crane was connected to what was happening to the Boone cattle and the Henderson herd and Gifford's lost land, then the thread she had been pulling since October, the slow gathering of understanding, had led somewhere she hadn't expected, and somewhere that mattered. She went to the locked drawer of the account book. Gideon had shown her which one, and she took out the ledger and she sat at the kitchen table, and she began to read it with the same attention she had once given to her father's shop accounts, which was the full attention of someone who understood that numbers were not just numbers, but stories. And that stories, read carefully enough, always told you more than they intended to. Gideon came back on the 4th day, not the 3rd. He rode in ahead of his men in the late afternoon, the light already failing, with the particular bearing of a man who had accomplished something difficult and was not in the mood to celebrate it. The 30 head were behind Pete and Darnell, bringing them in slowly, the cattle tired and bulky from the mountain cold. 2 men were tied across their horses behind Hatch, hands bound, both looking like they had experienced the limits of Gideon Boone's patience over the past several days. Evelyn was on the porch when he rode in. She had heard the cattle before she saw them and had come out without a coat, which she immediately regretted in the January air. Gideon dismounted and handed his horse to Tomas and looked at the 2 bound men and then at Evelyn. "We found them," he said. "I can see that." She looked at the 2 men. One was young enough to make her feel something complicated about the whole situation. The other was older, 40 or so, with the angular, shut face of someone who had made peace with bad decisions a long time ago. "Are they hurt?" "The older one has a cut on his arm. It's not serious." Gideon came up the porch steps and stopped at the top, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and cold on his face in the 3 days of stubble, and something else beneath all of that, a tautness that was not just tiredness. "We had company on the way back," he said quietly. 3 men on the ridge above the East Pass. They had rifles. She went still. "Were you—" "Nobody was shot." He said it flatly, the way you say things you want over quickly. "They were warning shots or bad aim. But they knew which pass we'd come back through, and they knew we'd have the prisoners with us. Someone told them." She thought about what Abellino had said about information and where it came from. She thought about the ledger she had spent the previous evening reading. "Come inside," she said. "There are things I need to tell you." He looked at her. "Now?" "After you've eaten and warmed up," she said. But tonight, she told him about the ledger at the kitchen table while he ate, which was not the ideal circumstance for delivering complicated information, but was the circumstance available. She had found in the accounts 3 payments made to a supplier in Durango that did not match any inventory entries she could locate. Not large payments, $30, $40, once 60 made on dates that she had cross-referenced with the dates of the other cattle losses in the valley. Gideon set down his fork when she got to the cross-referencing. "You checked the dates against the Henderson losses?" he said. "Abellino told me roughly when the Henderson cattle went missing. And the Marlowe family, there's a mention in your account book from October of lending Marlowe 3 hands for a week to help work his herd, and the note says it was because he'd had losses. I found the date." She put the ledger on the table and pointed to the margin note, the precise small handwriting that was Gideon's system for things he needed to carry forward. 2 weeks after that payment to Durango. Gideon looked at the page. Then he looked up at her. "You were doing this while I was gone," he said. "I was doing this while I was worried," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said in a while, and which she had not planned to say, and which she acknowledged with a slight internal wince. It helped to have something useful to do with it. He looked at the page again. He was quiet for long enough that she couldn't tell what he was thinking, which was unusual. She had learned to read him well enough that his silences were generally intelligible, but this one was not. Crane is in Durango twice a month, he said. For business, he says. Supplies, I know, she said. Pete mentioned it. That boy talks too much. He talks the right amount, she said. The information is useful. Something in Gideon's expression shifted, and for a moment she saw the exhaustion fully, not the physical kind, which was substantial, but the older kind. The kind comes from watching something wrong happen over a long time without being able to stop it cleanly. He had known about Crane for years. He had bought Gifford's land to keep it from foreclosure. He had watched the loans accrue and the valley shrink and had been unable to reach the root of it. I need to take this to the county sheriff, he said. I know, she said. But the sheriff needs to understand what he's looking at. I can write it out. The payment dates, the cross-references, what it suggests. Not accusations, just a clear account of what the numbers say, so that whoever reads it can understand it without already knowing the ledger. He looked at her. You'd do that. I was an account keeper for 7 years, she said. It's what I'm built for. He picked up his fork again. He ate. She refilled his coffee. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had been for 3 months, the same walls she had scrubbed, the same shelves she had organized, the same stove she had learned to run, and it felt, in the lamplight of that January evening, like a place that had substance, like a place that was real. Thank you, Gideon said, which he said rarely enough that she noticed it clearly every time. Don't thank me yet, she said. The numbers suggest. They don't prove, they're a start, he said. She sat down across the table from him and picked up the ledger and began making notes, because the start was what she had, and she had learned in the past 3 months that a start, managed carefully, was usually enough. The 2 prisoners were taken to town the following morning and turned over to the sheriff, a broad, deliberate man named Aldous Gear, who had held the position for 12 years and who listened to Gideon's account of the recovery with the particular attentiveness of someone who had been waiting for exactly this information. The younger of the 2 men, 19 it turned out, from a homestead family east of Durango, broke within 2 hours of arriving in the jail and told Sheriff Gear everything he knew, which was enough to establish that the operation had a coordinator in Redstone Creek, who was not himself a participant in the actual theft. He did not name Walter Crane. He described a man who had given him money and told him which properties to watch, and the description was careful and detail-free in the way that descriptions are when a person has been specifically told to keep them that way. But the sheriff was not a stupid man, and Evelyn's written account of the payment dates and the cross-references arrived at his office the following day by way of Abelino, and the combination of what the prisoner had said and what the numbers suggested was, as she had told Gideon it would be, a start, not a resolution. Starts were not resolutions. Evelyn knew the difference. She was at the post office 3 days after Gideon had come back from the mountains. She had a letter to post to her cousin in Philadelphia, the first detailed letter she had written since October, which she had spent most of the previous Sunday composing, and had described mostly as the situation has developed in unexpected ways, when Walter Crane came out of the dry goods store directly to her left and nearly walked into her. They both stopped. The main street of Redstone Creek in January was not a comfortable place for either of them to stand, and they both knew it, and they both stood there anyway for a moment, because the alternative was to turn and deliberately walk away from each other, and that had its own statement to make. Miss Hart, Walter said. He had recovered, she could see from the morning of her arrival. He was composed, his coat was good wool. He had the careful, unbothered manner of a man who had decided that the public episode on the depot platform was a story he had already reframed in his own favor. Mr. Crane, she said. He glanced toward the direction of the Boone ranch, which was not visible from the main street, but was visible in his implication. I trust you're finding your situation satisfactory, he said. I am, she said, Seth. I've heard you've made yourself useful up there. He said it with a tone that was not quite admiring and not quite dismissive, and landed precisely in the zone where a statement cannot be directly challenged. Boone's always needed someone to manage the house. He has a well-run property, she said. It didn't take much to manage. Walter's eyes were very still. The composed surface of his face was intact, but she had learned, in the months since October, to look at what was beneath people's surfaces. It was, she thought, what the ledger work had trained her to do. You looked past what was presented to what was actually there. What was beneath Walter Crane's composure was not embarrassment about the platform. It was calculation. He was calculating her right now, assessing what she knew and what she might have told, and what consequence might be building somewhere he couldn't yet see. Give my regards to Boone, he said, and moved past her. She mailed her letter. She walked back to where Abelino was waiting with the wagon. She did not look back at the store. "He looked at you the way a man looks at a problem he's trying to measure," Abelino said when she climbed up beside him. "I know," she said. "Let's go home." The word came out before she had examined it, and she let it stand, because it was accurate, and she had decided somewhere in the past 3 months to say accurate things rather than careful ones when the difference mattered. The retaliation came 3 weeks later, at 2 in the morning on a Thursday in late January. Evelyn was asleep when the first shot woke her. It was not a hunting sound or a distant sound, it was the immediate, violent crack of a rifle close to the property, and her body understood it before her mind did, sitting her upright in the dark with her heart already running fast, and her feet already moving toward the floor. She heard Gideon's door at the far end of the hall, and then boots on the stairs, and then the controlled urgency of his voice calling to the bunkhouse from the back door. She was already dressed. She slept in her clothes in winter, a habit from a childhood with inadequate heating that had served her well, and she was at her own door when she heard him in the hallway. "Stay inside," he said without stopping. He had his rifle. He was moving toward the back stairs. "What is armed men on the south side?" Darnell saw them from the bunkhouse 3, maybe 4. "They're moving toward the barn." He was at the top of the stairs. "Stay inside, Evelyn. Lock yourself in the kitchen and don't open the door unless it's my voice." He went down the stairs. She heard the back door open, and the winter air come through the house, and then the door shut behind him. And then there were more shots too, rapid, and then a pause, and then 2 more from a different position, which meant more than one shooter, which meant this was organized, which meant they had come ready. She stood in the hallway for approximately 4 seconds. Then she went to the kitchen. The shotgun was in the cabinet beside the back door, where it had been since she arrived, where she had known it was. Since her second week, she had organized that cabinet and found it, and filed its location in the same mental inventory as the carbolic and the clean cloths and everything else in this house that might someday matter. It was loaded. She checked it anyway, in the particular dark of the kitchen with the fire banked low, because checking is not distrust but discipline, and her grandmother had taught her that unloaded tools are worse than no tools at all. She moved to the kitchen window. Below and across the yard, she could see the barn, or rather she could see the light at the bottom of the barn's east wall, which was not lamplight, and was not the right color for lamplight, and her chest went cold with a specific, immediate fear that had nothing to do with herself. They were trying to burn the barn. The horses were in the barn. 30 head of recovered cattle were in the south corral, adjacent. If the barn went, the fire could reach the corral, and if the corral went, she heard Gideon shout something from the darkness near the barn, and she heard the sound of boots running, and then a shot very close to the house, not close to the barn, close to the house, from the east side, from a man who had come around while the others drew attention to the south. She moved. The back door was locked. She went to the side window of the kitchen instead, the one that faced east, and she looked out and could see the shape of a man moving along the wall toward the kitchen door, and she could see that he was not moving like someone who planned to knock. She had never shot at a person. She had shot at a tin can with her father once, years ago, and she had been a better shot than he expected, which she had never followed up on because the opportunities for target practice in Cincinnati were limited. She thought about this now, in the 4 or 5 seconds she had while the man moved along the wall, and she decided that the relevant question was not whether she could bring herself to fire at a human being, but whether she could bring herself to protect this house and these people, and the answer to that question was not in doubt. She positioned herself beside the window, not in front of it, and waited until the man reached the door, and when he tried the handle, she hit the window frame hard with the butt of the shotgun, not firing. Not yet. But the sound was what she intended, and the shape outside the window went rigid and then scrambled back from the door, and she tracked his movement to the edge of the east wall. "There are 2 loaded barrels pointed at you," she said, through the window glass, clearly, and without raising her voice more than was necessary to be heard. "Step into the yard where I can see you and put your hands up, or don't step into the yard and find out what happens." There was a silence. It lasted long enough that she wondered if he had run. Then the shape moved into the yard and the hands went up, and she could see that he was young, too young, and frightened in the specific way of someone whose plan had just gone badly wrong. "Don't move," she said. She didn't fire. She held her position and held the barrel level and held the man's attention until she heard Gideon's voice from across the yard. "Evelyn?" Sharp with something she hadn't heard in his voice before. "East side of the house," she called back. "I have one." The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. Then she heard his boots crossing the yard at speed. By first light, the situation was accounted for, which was not the same as resolved, but was at least legible. The men from the south side, there had been 4 total, had been driven off before they got the fire properly started, The barn's east wall had scorched but not caught, which was due entirely to Darnell and Pete reaching it with buckets from the water trough before the flame had purchase. 2 of the 4 had been caught by Gideon and Hatch in the pasture north of the barn. The man at the east wall of the house, the one Evelyn had held at the window, was the 3rd. The 4th had gotten away, back into the dark, taking his horse and whatever information he carried with him. Gideon stood in the kitchen in the gray morning light and looked at Evelyn with an expression she had never seen on his face before and could not immediately categorize. She was sitting at the table with the shotgun on the table in front of her, which was where it had been since she sat down, because she had not yet decided what to do with it and was not in the habit of putting things away before she decided. "I told you to stay inside," he said. "I did stay inside," she said. "The man at the east wall came to me. I just didn't let him in." "The barn was burning," she said, "or starting to, and there was a man at the kitchen door." She looked at him. "What would you have had me do?" He sat down across the table from her. He had a cut above his left eye from something in the dark. She had noticed it when he came in and had been waiting for the right moment to address it, and he was exhausted in a way that went past the physical into something more fundamental. He put both hands flat on the table, and she recognized the gesture because she did the same thing when she needed to be still. "I would have had you be safe," he said. "I was safe," she said. "Safer than you, actually, because I was inside with a loaded shotgun and you were in the dark with men shooting at you." She pushed the shotgun to the side of the table. "The cut above your eye needs cleaning." He touched it without looking away from her. "It's fine." "It isn't fine. It's bleeding onto your collar." She got up. She went to the shelf where the carbolic was. She had moved it from the washroom to the kitchen after Tomas's accident, because proximity matters when speed matters, and she brought it back to the table with a clean cloth. She cleaned the cut the same way she had cleaned Tomas's wound 3 months ago, which was without ceremony or excessive care for the subject's comfort, because Gideon Boone was the kind of man who responded better to efficiency than to gentleness. He sat still and let her do it, which was itself a thing she noted. When she had finished and was taping the edges together with the small strips of adhesive she had learned to keep on hand, she realized how close she was standing. Close enough to feel his stillness, which was not the stillness of patience, but the stillness of something else. She stepped back. "The man I held outside," she said. "Did he say anything?" "Not yet," Gideon said. "He'll talk." There was a quality in his voice that suggested he was certain of this in a way that had nothing to do with optimism. "All 3 of them will talk. Men who plan operations like this don't expect to be caught. They plan the exit, not the capture. Once they're captured, they have no reason to stay quiet. And when they talk, he said, we'll have what we need." He looked at the table. "If what they say points where I think it points." He stopped. "Say it," she said. He looked up at her. "When this is done," he said, "Crane is done. In this valley." He said it with the flatness of a statement rather than a threat, the way you say a thing you've been patient about for a long time and can now finally see the end of. She thought about Walter counting coins on the platform. She thought about Gifford losing his land and working day labor. She thought about the Marlowe family and the numbers in the ledger and the payments to Durango. "Good," she said. They sat in the kitchen in the gray January morning, the valley quiet outside the windows, the barn standing with its scorched wall, and the cattle in the south corral settled again now that the noise had stopped, and the ranch around them holding its ground the way things hold their ground when they've been built to last rather than to look like they last. Gideon was still looking at her. She had become accustomed in 3 months to being looked at by him in the way he looked at things he was trying to accurately understand. But there was a quality to it this morning that was different, and she was not sure she was ready to name it, and she was not going to name it in this kitchen at 6 in the morning after a night of fire and gunshots, and a man held at a window with a shotgun. She picked up the shotgun and put it back in its cabinet. "I'm going to make breakfast," she said. "Everyone will need to eat." She heard him stand up behind her. She heard him move toward the back door. He paused at it. "Evelyn," he said. She turned. He looked at her for a moment in a way that had several things in it that she could see clearly, and one thing she was choosing not to examine yet. "Thank you," he said, "for last night. For the ledger." For he stopped. Then for being here, she held his eyes for 1 second. "Go check on your barn," she said. He went. She turned to the stove. Her hands were completely steady. She noticed this and filed it. Outside, the valley came up into morning, cold and enormous and entirely indifferent, and the ranch sat in it the way it had sat in 100 such mornings, solid, imperfect, and still standing. All 3 men talked. It took Sheriff Gear 4 days and varying degrees of patience to get the full shape of it, but by the first week of February he had enough to bring to the county judge in Durango, and what he had was substantially what Gideon had expected and what Evelyn's ledger work had suggested. The two men caught in the North Pasture were career opportunists, the kind of men who moved through the territories following work that paid better than honest labor and required less sustained effort. They gave up names easily, because names were the only currency they had left. The young man Evelyn had held at the east wall of the house, whose name was Curtis Beale, 19 years old, from a failed homestead family outside Durango, gave up everything else, including dates, amounts, and the name of the man in Redstone Creek who had been paying him for information about which properties to target and when. Walter Crane did not go quietly. This was, in retrospect, predictable. A man who had spent 20 years building a careful surface presentation was not going to let it come down without a fight, and he had enough money and enough connections in Durango to make the process slow and contested. He hired a lawyer from Denver. He characterized the payments as legitimate business dealings, misunderstood by the sheriff's incomplete investigation. He produced a ledger of his own account of those Durango payments that told a cleaner story than the one the numbers actually told. But he was not, it turned out, the only person in Redstone Creek who had been keeping careful records. And Evelyn's written account, delivered to Sheriff Gear in late January, had been specific enough and cross-referenced enough that the alternative explanation strained credibility past the point a county judge was willing to accommodate. The formal charges came down in mid-February: conspiracy to commit theft of livestock, fraudulent contract terms on 3 separate loans, and 1 count of accessory to arson for the barn fire. Walter Crane was taken to Durango for arraignment on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, the entire town of Redstone Creek knew every detail, which was the nature of small towns and the nature of things that had been building for years and finally broke the surface. Evelyn heard about the arraignment from Pete, who heard it from the man who drove the supply wagon from Durango, who had apparently been present at the courthouse and had the particular gift of perfect recall for moments of public drama. Pete delivered this information to the kitchen doorway in the breathless, slightly disorganized way of a man who has been running and is not sure where to put down what he's carrying. They took him in a wagon, Pete said, in front of the whole main street. He didn't say a word, just sat in the wagon and stared straight ahead like he was somewhere else entirely. Evelyn looked at the bread she was working. Did the Marlows get any word? Pete blinked. This was not the response he had anticipated. I don't know, I'd have to ask. Find out, she said. The charges don't automatically resolve the loan situation. Someone will need to make sure the Marlows know where they stand legally, now that the man holding their paper is under criminal indictment. There may be someone at the court who can help them understand their options. She paused. Gifford, too, though his situation is different. Pete stared at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. Then he nodded. Yes, ma'am, he said, which was the first time he had called her that, and which she noticed but did not comment on. He went to find out. She kept working the bread. Gideon came in from the South Pasture that afternoon with Darnell, both of them quieter than the news of the day seemed to warrant. She had the bread out and coffee ready when they came through the door, and she watched Gideon wash his hands at the pump with the particular deliberateness of a man taking longer than necessary to wash his hands because he needs a moment before whatever comes next. He sat down. He picked up his coffee. You heard, she said. Abelino rode out to tell me. He drank. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would. She sat across from him, which had become the natural arrangement of their evenings over the past months, her across the table, his coffee on his side, the lamp between them. How did you think it would feel? He considered this. Finished, he said. It doesn't feel finished. Gifford still lost his land. The Marlows are still in debt. 3 years of watching this happen, and the best outcome I can point to is that the man responsible is in Durango waiting on a trial date. He set the cup down. It's justice, I suppose. It's just not the same thing as undone. It never is, she said. Undone isn't something that happens. You can correct a course, but you can't unsail the miles you went wrong. He looked at her with that steady, attending look. That's a good way to say it. My father used to say it, she said. About bad business decisions, mostly. He made several. She picked up her own cup. He was not a man who managed money well, which is somewhat ironic given that I am. Is that why you learned the accounts? Partly, she thought about it. And partly because I liked understanding how things worked. An account book is the true story of a place, not the story people tell about it, but the actual record of what they spent their time and money on. It tells you what they valued. She looked at him. Your mother's account books, if they exist, would tell me more about her than anything in that library. Gideon was quiet for a moment. They're in the locked drawer of the desk in the library, he said. I put them there when she died. I couldn't. He stopped. I never looked at them after. You don't have to, she said. I know I don't have to. He turned the cup. Maybe I should. He looked at the table. She would have liked you, he said, which seemed to cost him something, not the sentiment, but the admission of it. Evelyn felt the warmth of it and kept it off her face because some things are better received quietly. I would have liked her, she said, given the library. Something in him eased not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way that something under pressure eases when one more weight is set down rather than added. She had seen it before in him, usually in the evenings, usually when the conversation moved out of the practical and into whatever the practical was covering for. 3 months, he said. She looked up. He was looking at the table. Your contract, he said, it's up in 3 weeks. She had known this. She had known it for some time, and had been aware of it, the way you're aware of weather building on a distant horizon, not immediate, not yet requiring response, but present at the edge of every day's accounting. I know, she said. I want to talk about that, he said, before it arrives. I don't want it to arrive without us having talked about it. All right, she said. He looked up. He met her eyes and held them with the directness that was simply how he looked at things he wanted to see accurately, without the social softening that other men used as a buffer. I'd like you to stay, he said, not as a housekeeper. She waited. He deserved the space to say all of it. I want to be clear about what I mean, he said, with a slight friction of a man, navigating something he has thought about more than he has spoken about. I'm not asking you to stay because the kitchen is better, or because you found the fence post, or because you held a man at gunpoint in January. I'm asking you to stay because, he paused, because I have been paying attention for 3 months, and what I've seen is a person I want to be in proximity to, for the rest of the time I have. And that's not a thing I've said to anyone before, which is why I'm saying it badly. She looked at him, at the weathered face and the scar above his left eye that was still healing from January and the gray at his temples, and the hands on the table that she knew by now were capable of extraordinary gentleness even, when everything else about him suggested otherwise. You're not saying it badly, she said. You're saying it plainly. There's a difference. Is there an answer? He said. The steadiness of his voice cost him something, and she could see what it cost him, which was the knowledge that the answer was not certain, and that uncertain answers are the only kind that matter. Yes, she said, but I want to be clear about something too. She put her cup down carefully. I'm not going to be married in the way that Walter's letter described marriage, a capable companion in exchange for a stable roof. I don't think you're offering that, but I want to say it plainly. I'm not offering that, Gideon said. I know, she said. I want to say it anyway. Then say it, he said, which was the right response and which she appreciated. If I stay, she said, I stay as your equal. In this house, on this ranch, in whatever decisions need to be made about either. I'm not a piece of property, and I'm not a service, and I'm not something that arrived on a train and got redirected. I am a person who is choosing to be here, and I need that to be the understood shape of the thing. Gideon looked at her across the lamplit table for a long moment. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. I never would have. She believed him. She had believed him, she realized, for some time. Then yes, she said, I'll stay. The town predictably had opinions. Not all of them were unkind, but enough of them were pointed that Evelyn became aware of the pointed ones through the medium of things people said to her face that were designed to land obliquely rather than directly. Mrs. Alderman at the boarding house, when Evelyn went to post a letter in late February, said something about how wonderful it was that things had worked out so well, with a tone that implied the working out was suspicious in its convenience. A woman named Clara Finch, who Evelyn had seen at the general store several times and who had always been cordial, made a comment about how Gideon Boone had always needed someone to settle him down, in the specific tone of a person who is simultaneously paying a compliment and suggesting the settling was an act of management rather than choice. The one that reached her most directly was not said to her face at all. Pete mentioned, with the discomfort of a man delivering information he wished he didn't have, that he had overheard Toomas at the saloon, saying that Boone had effectively taken another man's mail-order bride, which made the whole enterprise questionable in their estimation. She was in the kitchen garden when Pete told her this, turning the winter soil for the spring planting, and she set down her fork and looked at the mountains for a moment, which she had learned was a reliable way to put things in their correct proportion. Walter Crane, she said, purchased an advertisement for a wife the way a man orders from a catalog. When what arrived didn't suit him, he tried to return it. I don't belong to Walter Crane, I never did. She picked up her fork again. And I'd suggest that anyone who thinks otherwise might want to examine what they think marriage is. Pete looked slightly relieved, as if he'd been carrying something he could now set down. Yes, ma'am, he said. Also, she said, without looking up from the soil, I'd suggest you stop spending time in the saloon when you have fence mending to do. The south corner post is still leaning. Pete left to attend to the fence post. Evelyn kept turning the soil. The town's opinion, she had decided, was something she would outlive. Not by arguing with it, argument gave it more substance than it deserved, but simply by continuing to be present, and to act in ways that made the opinion look gradually more foolish over time. She had seen this done by women in Cincinnati who had survived various public difficulties, and the method was consistent. You did your work, you behaved with dignity, you made yourself useful in ways that were clearly visible, and you let time do the arithmetic. Gideon took her riding in March, when the worst of the winter had broken enough that the high trails were passable. It was not planned in any formal way. He came to the kitchen one morning and said the East Ridge had a view she should see, and she said she hadn't been on a horse since before Cincinnati, and he said that was something that needed correcting, and she said she agreed, and that was the entire negotiation. The horse he gave her was a bay mare named Patience, who had a gentler disposition than her ranch companions, and who responded, Evelyn discovered, to a calm and consistent hand in a way that rewarded paying attention. By the time they reached the base of the East Ridge, which took about 40 minutes along a trail that wound through old pines, she had developed a basic functional understanding of the mare, and felt something that was not quite confidence, but was in that direction. The view from the ridge was everything Gideon had said it was, which was one of the reliable things about him he did not oversell. The valley spread below them in the early March light, with its creek running red-brown from the iron soil, and the ranch visible at 3 miles, recognizable by the cottonwood drive and the shape of the buildings, and beyond it Redstone Creek's small congregation of structures, and beyond that the long reach of the valley into the mountains on both sides, still mostly white on their upper slopes. She sat on the mare and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. When I came back from the war, Gideon said, beside her on the gray horse, I rode up here the first day. I needed to see that it was still here. He paused. It's a strange thing to have been away from something and come back and find it entirely unchanged when you've changed entirely. She looked at him. How long were you away? 4 years, he said. 63 to 67 with the mop-up work at the end. He looked at the valley. My father managed the ranch through it. He was old by the time I got back, and he died the following spring. I think partly from relief, like he'd been holding everything together until someone else could take it, and then he simply let go. She thought about this. About a young man coming back from 4 years of something she could only partially imagine, returning to a valley that looked exactly as he'd left it, and finding himself standing in it like a stranger in a familiar house. You've been managing things for a long time, she said. Since I was 24, he said. The ranch, the hands, the land. All of it. He turned the gray horse a fraction, adjusting for the footing. It was necessary. I didn't resent it mostly. But there is a kind of, he searched, a kind of solitude that comes from being the person who manages things. People look to you for decisions, and you get used to making them, and at some point you stop expecting anyone to stand alongside you while you make them. You just do it. She thought about the evening he had shown her the account book. The way he had said, I thought you should know not as a report to an employee, but as something else, something that assumed she was part of the same concern. You've been doing that for a while, actually, she said. Standing alongside, I mean. He looked at her. Since about November, she said. You just called it something else. He was quiet for a moment, with the expression of a man looking at a thing from an angle he hadn't previously considered, and finding the new angle accurate. I suppose I did, he said. They rode along the ridge for another hour, not always talking, which was one of the things she had come to understand was its own form of ease. A person you couldn't be quiet with was a person you were performing for, and she had done enough performing in the last year to be tired of it. On the way back down, the trail narrowed through the pines, and Patience chose a line slightly wide of the path and caught a root, stumbling briefly, and Evelyn's stomach dropped before the mare recovered. Gideon was there instantly, not grabbing, not overcorrecting, just present at her shoulder with his hand extended in case it was needed, and then withdrawing it smoothly when it was clear the mare had her footing. I'm fine, she said. I know, he said. I was checking on Patience. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. But the corner of his mouth had done the thing it did not quite a smile. Still, but unmistakably heading in that direction, and she found that she was smiling properly, without managing it, in a way she hadn't done in a long time. The house on the mesa was Abellino's idea in origin, though he denied this when she mentioned it later. What she knew was that in early April, Gideon began disappearing for several hours on certain afternoons with Abellino and Hatch, and the wagon loaded with lumber, and when she asked where they were going, Abellino said the creek pasture, and when she asked Gideon, he said nothing specific, and looked like a man who was not accustomed to keeping things from people, and was finding it more difficult than anticipated. She did not press. She had learned that patience was not the same as passivity, and that some things revealed themselves better on their own schedule than when pursued. Her 3-month contract ended on a Wednesday in mid-April, unmarked by any ceremony because they had already moved past the ceremony of it in the kitchen in February. She woke that Wednesday the same as any other morning, went downstairs, started the stove, made the coffee, and when Gideon came in from morning rounds, he sat at the table and looked at her with a slightly formal expression that meant he had prepared something to say. "Today is technically the day your contract expires," he said. "I'm aware," she said. "I'd like to take you somewhere this afternoon," he said, "if you're willing." She looked at him. "Is this related to the lumber?" "It's related to the lumber," he admitted. "Then yes," she said. "I'm willing." The mesa was about 1.5 miles north of the ranch house, accessible by a trail that climbed through a stand of aspens and came out onto a flat-topped rise above the creek. She had seen it from the valley. It was visible on the eastern side of the property, a raised plateau that caught the afternoon light differently than the surrounding land. But she had not been up to it. When the trail came out of the aspens and onto the mesa, she stopped her horse. The house was framed. Not finished. Not even close to finished, but framed. The bones of it standing in the afternoon light. 2 stories. A porch along the south side, facing the valley and the mountains beyond. The creek was audible below. From where she sat on the mare, she could see the entire length of the valley, Redstone Creek at its far end, the ranch below, the long run of mountains on both sides. Gideon had pulled up beside her. He was looking at the house, not at her. "It's smaller than the main house," he said. "For now. It can be added onto." She looked at the framing, at the south-facing porch, at the way the site had been chosen so that you could see both the valley and the mountains without having to turn. "You chose the site so the porch faces south," she said. "The kitchen garden will do better on the east slope," he said, gesturing to the right of the house. "More afternoon sun. The soil up here needs working, but it's good underneath." She looked at him. "You already thought about the kitchen garden." "I thought about a lot of things." He looked at her. "I don't want you living inside the life I inherited," he said. "The main house is my father's house and his father's before that. It has its history, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He stopped. "I wanted us to have a place that was ours, that we built, that nobody handed to either of us." He paused. Does that make sense? She looked at the framed house standing on the mesa in the April afternoon. The creek below it, and the mountains above it, and the valley laid out like an account of everything she had arrived at from a position of nothing. She thought about a train platform in October, about $7 in a notebook and a man counting coins, about a kitchen that had been waiting, and a library that had been locked, and a young man's broken arm, and a shotgun in January, and 4 months of arithmetic that had led somewhere she had not been able to predict from any of its beginning terms. "It makes complete sense," she said. She dismounted and walked toward the house, and Gideon dismounted and came with her, and they walked through the framing together, through what would be the main room, through what would be the kitchen, out onto the south porch where the afternoon sun was still warm enough to feel, and she put her hand on one of the upright posts and felt the wood, which was solid and straight and had not yet become anything, but had all the material of becoming in it. "When did you start building it?" she asked. "March," he said. After the ride on the East Ridge, she looked at him. "That was only 2 weeks after you asked me to stay." "I knew before I asked," he said. "I wanted to be sure I had something real to offer. Not just the main house and whatever arrangement we could come to. Something built on purpose." He put his hands in his pockets in the way he did when he was standing still, and not quite sure what to do with himself. "You told me you didn't want to be a housekeeper. You told me you wanted to be an equal. I thought the least I could do was build an equal place to start from." She stood on the framed porch with the valley below her, and her hand on the post, and felt something she recognized from very deep in her, not happiness, exactly, though happiness was part of it, but the specific feeling of something landing accurately, of arriving at a place that was genuinely intended for you, rather than a place you'd been redirected to. "I should tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going to be easy to live with," she said. "I have opinions about account books and stove flues and fence posts, and I will tell you when I disagree with a decision, and I will not always be wrong." She kept her eyes on his. "I've been managing alone for long enough that the managing is built into how I think, and that doesn't always make a person comfortable to have around." "I know," he said. "And you're not easy either," she said. "You're closed, and you're slow to talk about things that matter, and you carry more than you should without asking for help." "I know that too," he said. "As long as we both know," she said. "As long as we both know," he agreed. And the way he said it was not a concession but an acceptance, which was different, and which she recognized clearly. She looked at the valley one more time, at the long, improbable distance between the woman who had stood on a train platform in October with nowhere to go, and the woman standing on a mesa in April with a half-built house under her hand and a choice she had made. For herself, deliberately, with her eyes fully open. "All right," she said. "Yes, all of it." Gideon reached into his coat pocket. He took out a ring, simple gold worn smooth, the kind of ring that has been handled for a long time by hands that worked, and held it out toward her. "My mother's," he said. "I found it in the locked drawer with the account books. She left it there, which I think—" He stopped. "I think she meant for it to be found when someone was ready to find it." Evelyn looked at the ring in his palm. She thought about the woman who had built the library and organized the books by theme rather than by category, and kept her account books in the locked drawer where her son would eventually have to go looking, and she thought that she understood something about that woman, even having never met her. That was useful to know. She held out her hand. Gideon put the ring on her finger with the careful steadiness of a man doing something that matters. It fit, which seemed to her as good an omen as any. Below the mesa, the creek ran red-brown in the April afternoon, and the valley held its cold mountain light, and the ranch sat where it had sat for 30 years solid, imperfect, and still standing, and on the framed porch of a house that was not yet anything but would be. Two people stood in the particular quiet of a decision that has been made and does not require further discussion. She turned his mother's ring once on her finger. The gold was warm. "Finish the kitchen first," she said. Gideon looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. This time it went all the way. "Yes," he said. "I will." The kitchen on the Mesa house was finished by the end of May, which was 2 weeks later than Gideon had planned because the stovepipe fitting required a second trip to Durango for the right-size coupling, and because Evelyn had specific requirements about the placement of the shelving that necessitated rebuilding one section after it was already up. Gideon had not argued about the shelving. He had looked at her revised specification, agreed that her reasoning was correct, and told Hatch to pull the section and redo it. Hatch had not been pleased. Evelyn had given him an extra portion at dinner for 3 consecutive nights without comment, which Hatch accepted with the grace of a man who understood when he was being fairly compensated. The wedding was on a Saturday in June, which was Evelyn's choice for reasons that were partly practical. June was between the spring cattle work and the haying season, which meant the ranch hands could attend without abandoning critical tasks, and partly something else, something she did not fully examine, but that had to do with the quality of June light in the valley, which was different from every other month. Cleaner and more generous, as if the mountains had temporarily agreed to be less severe. She had not wanted a large ceremony. Gideon had not wanted one either, which was one of the ongoing satisfactions of their arrangement. They rarely needed to negotiate preferences, because their preferences, when set beside each other, turned out to be largely compatible in the ways that mattered and productively different in the ways that kept things interesting. What they ended up with was not large, exactly, but was larger than either of them had planned, because the valley had its own opinion about what this particular wedding deserved and expressed it through the medium of people simply arriving. The Marlows came. All 5 of them, the parents and 3 children, in their good clothes, the mother carrying a jar of preserved peaches that she pressed into Evelyn's hands, with a directness that did not invite refusal. Evelyn accepted them and said, "Thank you," and meant it. Mrs. Marlowe held her hands for a moment and said quietly, "We know what you did with the ledger." And Evelyn said it was nothing, and Mrs. Marlowe said it was not nothing, and they understood each other. Gifford came alone on a borrowed horse, wearing a coat that had seen better years but had been carefully brushed. He shook Gideon's hand for a long time without saying much of anything, and Gideon let him, and that was its own kind of conversation. Dr. Whitfield came, and expressed no surprise at the occasion, which suggested he had seen the direction of things earlier than most. Sheriff Gear came, and brought his wife, who was a small, observant woman who looked at Evelyn with the specific appraisal of someone deciding whether to like her, and arrived at her conclusion within about 4 minutes, after which she was straightforwardly warm. Pete was there, and Darnell, and Hatch, and Clement, and Tomas, who had his healed arm in a clean shirt for the first time Evelyn had seen, and Abelino, who stood at the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who had waited a long time for something and was now watching it arrive. There was a judge from Durango who performed the ceremony in the plain, direct language of civil law, which suited both of them better than any elaboration would have. Gideon said yes when asked. Evelyn said yes when asked. The judge pronounced them married. Gideon put his mother's ring, which he had taken back temporarily for this moment, and now replaced with the deliberateness of someone finishing something that had been started by someone else and deserved to be properly completed on her finger for the second time. Someone had brought a fiddle. The afternoon went on longer than any of them had planned, and the preserved peaches from Mrs. Marlowe appeared on a table alongside things other people had brought that nobody had organized or requested, and the valley held its June light until well past 7 in the evening. And when Evelyn finally stood at the edge of the gathering in the long dusk with Gideon beside her, looking at the people spread across the yard of the main ranch house because the Mesa house was home, but the main house had the space, she felt the full weight of the distance she had traveled, and let herself feel it, because some things deserved to be felt completely rather than managed. Mrs. Alderman is here, she said quietly. Gideon looked. The boarding house owner was standing near the food table with a plate, talking to the sheriff's wife. She came, he said with a neutrality that covered a more specific observation. She came, Evelyn agreed. That's the thing about time. It does the arithmetic for you, eventually. Gideon looked at her with the look she had come to know, as the fullest version of his attention, the one that appeared when something she said landed precisely somewhere in him. You've been waiting for that to be true, he said. Since about November, she said. Yes. He put his hand over hers where it rested on the porch railing. He did not say anything. She did not need him to. Walter Crane's trial concluded in September in Durango, which Evelyn learned about from a letter Sheriff Gear sent to Gideon rather than from any public announcement, because the Durango newspaper had covered the arraignment extensively enough that the actual verdict felt anticlimactic by comparison. He was convicted on the livestock conspiracy charge and on 2 of the 3 loan fraud counts. The third was dismissed on a technicality involving the precise wording of the original agreement, which the Denver lawyer had successfully argued was ambiguous. He was sentenced to 4 years and fined substantially, though the fine was largely theoretical given the state of his finances, once the legal costs had been deducted. The dry goods store was sold to pay his debts. It was purchased by a man named Ellery from Denver, who had no prior history in Redstone Creek, and who turned out to be a competent, unremarkable businessman, which was the best thing the town could have hoped for someone who ran a store without operating a parallel enterprise beneath it. The Marzalo's loan was restructured through the court as part of the fraud conviction, the fraudulent terms set aside, and the original verbal agreement of 5% over 2 years recognized as the operative document. It did not erase what the family had lost in the years of overpayment, but it meant they kept their land, which was the central thing. Gifford's situation was different and did not have a clean resolution, which Evelyn had known going in and had tried to prepare herself for, but found, when it was confirmed, was still something she had to sit with. The land had been legally transferred before the criminal proceedings began, and Gideon already owned it, and there was no mechanism by which the conviction could undo a prior legal transfer. What Gideon could do and did, in October, without making a production of it, was offer Gifford a long-term lease on 20 acres of the recovered land at a rate so far below market value as to be effectively nominal, with the option to purchase at fair value once he had rebuilt his savings. Gifford accepted. He came back to work the land he had lost, which was not the same as having it back but was something real, and something he had built himself rather than received as charity. Evelyn wrote it all into the account book: the Marlowe resolution, the Gifford lease terms, the sale of the Crane store, numbers as story the way she had always understood them, the true record of what people spent their time and effort on, which was ultimately the only honest measure of what they valued. The Mesa house, by its first winter, had become exactly what Gideon had said. He wanted it to be a place that was theirs in a way the main house could not be. Not because the main house was unwelcoming, but because there is a difference between inhabiting someone else's history and building your own. They kept the main house in use. It was the practical center of ranch operations, and the hands needed the proximity to the kitchen stores and the tack room. But they slept on the mesa and spent their evenings there. And the kitchen that Evelyn had specified shelf placement for became, over the course of that first year, the truest version of the kitchen she had been working toward since she walked into the neglected one in the main house and decided it wasn't impossible. The library at the main house was unlocked now, permanently. Evelyn had suggested this in July, carefully, and Gideon had agreed, and she had moved several of the most fragile volumes to the better-lit room off the main stair, and organized the rest with fresh labeling that preserved the system his mother had used while making it legible, to someone encountering it without prior knowledge. The hands knew the library was available to them, and some of them used it, and some of them didn't, and this seemed to Evelyn exactly the right proportion. She found Mrs. Boone's account books in December, the ones from the locked drawer, the ones Gideon had left there after his mother's death. She did not open them without asking him. She brought the subject up one evening at the Mesa house, at the kitchen table that had become the center of their evenings, the way the table in the main house had been before. "I'd like to look at your mother's account books," she said, "if you're willing." He looked up from what he was reading. "Why? Because I think she was a remarkable woman, and I want to understand her better," she said. "And because a person's accounts are honest in a way that most things aren't." She paused. "Also because I think there may be things in them that are useful for managing the ranch, if her notes were as careful as her library organization suggests." He was quiet for a moment. "They're in the drawer," he said. "You have the key. I wanted to ask first," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That's why I said yes." The account books were extraordinary. 3 volumes spanning 15 years, with marginalia that went beyond numbers into observations about the soil, about the cattle rotations, about which hands stayed longest and why, about water sources and their reliability across seasons. Mrs. Boone had been, Evelyn discovered over the course of several evenings, a working partner, in every sense not a woman who managed the house while her husband managed the land, but someone who had understood the ranch as a whole system and tracked it with the attention of someone who had made it a serious intellectual enterprise. She showed Gideon the sections on cattle rotation the following week. He read them at the kitchen table in the way he read things that mattered slowly, going back, reading sections twice. She figured out the southern rotation pattern 20 years ago, he said. We've been using a modified version of it, and I didn't know it came from her. You knew it came from your father, Evelyn said. My father learned it from her, he said. He set the book down and looked at the table for a moment, in the particular way of someone revising a significant thing. He never said to that. I don't know if he did it deliberately, or if it never occurred to him to say it. It probably never occurred to him, she said. That's usually how it goes. He looked at her. Is that why you're so particular about being named in things? The ledger work. The fence post. I'm not particular about being named, she said. I'm particular about being included in the thinking. There's a difference. She picked up her coffee. Your mother understood things about this ranch that shaped how it runs today. That's worth knowing. Not to correct the record doesn't need correcting. It's too late for that. But because understanding where knowledge actually comes from tells you something about how to find more of it. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. She would have liked you, he said, for the second time, with the same quality of cost that it had the first time, which told her it was true both times. I know, she said simply, because she believed it. Their son, Caleb, was born in the spring of the second year, which arrived after a winter that was difficult in the way mountain winters were difficult, not catastrophically, but persistently, with a cold that settled in and refused to fully lift until late March. He was born in the Mesa house with Dr. Whitfield in attendance and Abelino waiting downstairs with the particular rigid stillness of a man who had faced more visible dangers with greater composure. The labor was long and genuinely hard, and Evelyn did not pretend otherwise, and Gideon, who had been told by several people that the right thing to do was wait outside, had ignored this advice entirely and been present throughout, which Evelyn had neither asked for nor discouraged, and which turned out to be the right decision, because at a certain point she had needed to hold on to something solid, and he was the most solid thing available. Caleb was born at 4 a.m, with the mountain cold still pressed against the windows and the stove burning well in the kitchen below. He was not a beautiful infant, in the way that infants were sometimes described. He was red and loud and entirely himself from the first moment, which Evelyn considered a good sign. Gideon held him with the careful, slightly overwhelmed attention of a man who had managed considerable difficulty in his life, and was discovering that this particular difficulty was unlike anything in his prior experience. He held him for a long time without saying anything, and when he finally looked up at Evelyn, the expression on his face was not something she had a word for and did not need one. Hello, he said to the baby with the same plain directness he applied to everything that mattered. Caleb, being 3 minutes old, had no response, but he stopped crying for a moment, which Evelyn chose to count. Their daughter Lillian came 2 years after Caleb, with considerably less ceremony and somewhat more efficiency, which Dr. Whitfield noted approvingly, and Evelyn considered fair compensation for the previous experience. Lillian was, from the beginning, a person of strong opinions delivered without apology, which Gideon observed with an expression of resignation so specific that Evelyn laughed out loud, and he looked at her and said, I can see exactly where she gets it, and she said, I take that as a compliment, and he said it was intended as one, and that was, in its way, a complete description of their marriage. The children grew up on the mesa and the ranch and the valley, which meant they grew up understanding that land was not a backdrop, but a system, something you learned the way you learned a language, through constant immersion and the accumulated weight of small specific details. Caleb was Gideon's in the way that children are sometimes clearly one parent's. He had the same deliberate quality, the same economy of speech, the same tendency to look at things from a distance before approaching them. He was on horseback competently by the time he was 5, which Gideon had facilitated with the patience of a man who understood that some kinds of knowledge could not be rushed. Lillian was different. She was everywhere and in everything, and had, from about age 3, the specific gift of locating whatever was most interesting in any given room and going directly to it. She found the library the way water finds its level, inevitably, and without apparent effort, and by the time she was 6 she had developed opinions about the organizational system that she expressed to Evelyn with the confidence of someone who had not yet learned to preface opinions with apologies. The natural science books should be together, Lillian said at 6, standing in the library doorway. They're all spread around. Your grandmother organized them by theme, Evelyn said, which means the natural sciences appear in several sections because they connect to several themes. Lillian considered this. That's inefficient, she said. It's a different kind of efficiency, Evelyn said. It depends on what you're trying to find. If you know the subject, the current system is harder. If you're browsing to see what connects to what, it's better. Lillian thought about this for longer than most 6-year-olds would have, which told Evelyn something about her daughter that she already knew. Both systems could be true at once, Lillian said finally. Yes, Evelyn said. Most good arguments contain that possibility. Lillian went into the library and found the book she was looking for, and took it to the reading chair in the corner, the one that had been Mrs. Boone's, the one Evelyn had found Gideon in that Sunday morning in their first winter, and sat in it with the specific comfort of a child who has found a place that fits, and read. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her, and felt the particular sensation of a long thread pulled taut between a past she had not chosen and a present she had built, running clean and true through all the distance between them. The school came about because of a practical problem, which was the way most things in Redstone Creek came about. The town had a school teacher for 3 years after Evelyn arrived, who then left to marry a man in Denver, and the replacement was slow in coming, and when he came he stayed 8 months, and then found the winters disagreeable and the salary insufficient, and left also. By the time the third search for a replacement was underway, the town had spent 2 years in a patchwork of informal arrangements, and Evelyn had spent 2 years watching children in the valley receive inconsistent instruction and thinking about what her father had said about knowledge being for using rather than keeping respectable. She did not volunteer to teach the school herself. She was running a ranch household and raising 2 children and managing the Boone accounts and had a specific census of the limits of her available hours. What she did was organize. She identified 3 women in the valley who had sufficient education and sufficient willingness to share it, negotiated a rotation between them, with a small stipend drawn from a subscription fund she assembled by going to every family in the valley and explaining simply that the alternative to contributing was continued educational instability. And she set up a proper schedule and found the school building a better stove, and donated 12 books from the Boone Library, and went to Durango herself, with Gideon and a list, to find a permanent teacher who was the right fit rather than the available fit. The permanent teacher they found was a woman of 32 named Miss Arden, who had been teaching in Denver and wanted something that felt more like a place and less like a transit point. She stayed 17 years. The subscription library came 2 years after the school, which was Evelyn's idea, and which Gideon funded with the pragmatic generosity of a man who had watched what books had done for his mother and for his household, and considered it a legitimate ranch investment. It occupied a room at the back of the building that had once housed Crane's dry goods store, a coincidence of real estate that Evelyn appreciated with a dry satisfaction she did not express publicly. She organized the collection. She spent 3 months writing to publishers in the East and to the Denver Library Association and to her cousin in Philadelphia, who turned out to have connections to a book supplier she had never mentioned in any of the sympathetic but largely useless letters she had sent over the years. The cousin, galvanized by a specific and clearly articulated request rather than a general situation, proved useful. 200 volumes arrived in crates in the spring. Evelyn cataloged them herself over the course of a week, at the kitchen table in the Mesa house, with Caleb asking questions about what everything was, and Lillian reading the ones she could reach before they were cataloged. "You're going to undermine my filing system," Evelyn said. "I'm previewing the collection," Lillian said, without looking up. Gideon, who was at the table with his account, said nothing. The corner of his mouth moved. There is a specific October afternoon, 10 years after Evelyn Hart arrived at the depot in Redstone Creek with a battered valise and a hat box and nowhere to go, that she carries with her more clearly than most. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't. It was an unremarkable afternoon in every external sense. The weather was clear and cold, the aspens on the mesa already fully turned to their brief, violent gold, the creek audible below the house in the particular way it ran in autumn when the snowmelt had slowed, and the water was low and clear. She was on the porch of the Mesa house, the south-facing porch that she had stood on when it was only framing, and the valley had been laid out below her, like the answer to a question she was still formulating. She was mending a tear in Caleb's jacket that had resisted the previous 2 repair attempts, because he kept tearing it in the same place with the specific determination of a child who has not yet made peace with the concept of avoiding known hazards. From the porch she could see Gideon in the far paddock, teaching Caleb to work with a young horse that was not yet fully settled. She could see the careful, repetitive patience of what he was doing, not demanding, not correcting harshly, just being present and consistent, until the animal understood that consistent presence was not a threat. She had watched him do this many times, and it still told her something each time, about the man, and about the method, and about the way some kinds of trust are built so slowly you barely perceive the building until you look back and see the structure. Lillian was inside, allegedly helping Abelino with the afternoon fire, actually asking him questions about the south fence rotation and the water table on the east ridge, because Lillian's idea of help was frequently the acquisition of information she considered relevant. Abelino, who had once described Gideon as difficult but fair, had amended this characterization for Lillian to formidably curious, which Evelyn considered accurate and encouraging in roughly equal measure. She set down the mending for a moment and looked at the valley. 10 years. She had been in this valley for 10 years, and the woman she had been on that platform, the woman who would not pick up the coins, who had sat down on a bench with a notebook and tried to calculate a future out of $7 and nowhere to go, felt like someone she remembered clearly but could not quite imagine being again. Not because she was better than that woman, or further from her circumstances. She understood perfectly well how close any life is to the edge of its own undoing. She had not forgotten the arithmetic of helplessness. But she had learned in 10 years on this mesa and in this valley something she had not known how to articulate on that platform, though she had been acting on its principle even then, that the direction of a life is not determined by what it is given, but by what it chooses to do with the material it has. Walter Crane had given her nothing in the end, except the necessity of making a decision. The decision had been hers. Every subsequent decision had been hers too, to stay, to work, to speak plainly, to hold a shotgun steady in January, to write out the payment dates in careful columns, to say yes on a mesa in April with her hand on an unfinished post. None of it had been smooth. None of it had arrived without cost. The barn wall was still faintly discolored where the fire had started, which Gideon had decided not to repaint over because he said he preferred honest walls. She had misread 2 situations in 10 years that she wished she hadn't misread. There had been a winter when the cattle losses from weather were bad enough to require a difficult renegotiation with a creditor in Durango, and she had spent 3 weeks at the account books, finding the path through it, and had not slept well for most of those 3 weeks. Gideon was still on certain days closed in the way that she understood but found wearing, and she was still on certain days managing in the way that he found abrasive, and they had learned to tell each other so, rather than to manage around it, which was better but was not always comfortable. She thought about what it meant that this was what she had chosen, and what it meant that it was genuinely what she wanted, and she found that these 2 facts were the same fact, which was not something she had been certain was possible until she had experienced it. The aspens on the slope were losing their gold in the afternoon wind, a slow, steady shedding, each leaf a small specific thing that had been exactly what it needed to be, and was now letting go in its own time. She had watched aspens do this for 10 autumns, and she still watched them do it as if it were the first time, which told her something about herself that she considered encouraging. Gideon came up from the paddock with Caleb, the boy talking with the velocity he sustained after any stretch of time doing something that had engaged him fully. She could hear the shape of the conversation without the words, Caleb's rapid, specific questions, and Gideon's shorter, considered answers, and Caleb's further questions that built on the answers, which was how he had learned everything he'd ever learned, and which she recognized as her own method in a body that was more his father's than hers. Gideon looked up at the porch and saw her there, and raised one hand, which was his greeting from a distance, the same as it had been for 10 years, simple, consistent, the gesture of a man who does not waste what he means. She raised her hand back. Caleb saw her too and immediately began reporting the afternoon's progress at increased volume across the distance of the yard, the specific enthusiasm of a child who assumes that all information of interest to him is of equal interest to all available adults. She listened and called back appropriate responses and watched Gideon's expression as the boy talked. The look on his face that was the fullest version of something she had first seen in the corner of his mouth on a winter evening, when she had said something about the stove flue, and he had not quite smiled. He was smiling now, properly, with the particular quality of a man who does not do it easily, and therefore does it truly. Inside, Lillian said something to Abelino in a tone that suggested the answer she had received was not the answer she was looking for, and Abelino said something back in the patient, measured cadence of a man who had been navigating stubborn people for 60 years and had arrived at peace with it. Evelyn picked up the mending. The valley was going into the long evening light of Colorado October, the kind that turned everything amber for 40 minutes before the mountains took it away. The creek below the mesa caught it and ran copper-colored for that brief window, and the aspens shed their last leaves in the wind, and the ranch below them held its ground in the gathering dusk, solid and imperfect and entirely real. She thought about a train platform, about $7 and a notebook, and a man who had counted coins on a depot bench to tell her what he thought she was worth. She thought about what she had built out of the materials that moment had forced her to work with, not despite the difficulty of them, but partly because of it. The difficulty had been the instruction. The platform had been the beginning of the only education that had ever truly mattered. The education of learning what she was made of when there was nothing left to rely on but the answer to that question. Some things cannot be taught before they are needed. Some knowledge only exists in the using of it. She had not known on that train what she was capable of. She had not known it until she needed to know it, and then she had found out, and the finding out had been the making of everything else. That was what she wanted her children to understand. Not the story itself, they would learn the story eventually. In fragments, from Abelino and from Pete and from the way people in Redstone Creek sometimes looked at their mother with a kind of recognition that came from having watched something happen over time. They would learn the external facts of it. What she wanted them to understand was the principle beneath the facts, that a life is not given to you. It is built. Out of the specific materials of the specific circumstances you find yourself in, including the bad ones. Especially the bad ones. The bad ones are the ones that show you what you have to work with. She had arrived in this valley with nowhere to go and had built, from nothing she could have anticipated, something that was genuinely and specifically hers. Not because someone had given it to her, because she had stayed on the bench, opened the notebook, refused the coin, and done the arithmetic. Gideon came up the porch steps with Caleb still talking at his side. He sat in the porch chair beside her, the chair they had brought from the main house, from the reading room. When they moved to the mesa, the one that had been his mother's, and Caleb finally ran out of immediate commentary and went inside to find Lillian, which would produce its own kind of noise shortly. And the porch went quiet in the way it went quiet when there were only two people on it who had learned to share silence comfortably. "Good afternoon," she asked. "He's getting it," Gideon said. "He doesn't know he's getting it yet, which is actually better. The knowing tends to make people tighten up." "That applies to most things," she said. "Most things," he agreed. The amber light was moving up the valley wall to the west, withdrawing upward as the shadow followed. She watched it go. He watched it with her, his hand finding hers on the arm of the chair in the unhurried way of a man who is not performing tenderness, but is simply putting his hand where it belongs. Somewhere below, Caleb found Lillian and the noise began, and Abelino said something in response that made both children go momentarily and surprisingly quiet, which was a skill Evelyn had never been able to fully account for in him, and had stopped trying to analyze. The aspens let go of their last October gold. The creek ran copper in the fading light. The mountains held their position at the edges of the sky, cold and enormous and entirely themselves, and the valley between them held its ground, and the house on the mesa held its ground too, solid and honest and built on purpose, from the right materials, for a life that had been chosen freely. That was enough. She had come to understand more than enough. It was everything.